All right, should be recording now. So today I have Matthew Hartke and Ben, the amateur exegete, joining me. So before we start, just brief introductions. I know both of you have been on my channel multiple times. So just in case somehow anyone doesn't know who you are, let's start with you, Matthew, because you're next to me on the screen.
I mean, this is probably a blanket statement for all of us, but I am an amateur who is just, I love biblical studies. That love started as a Christian, and I'm no longer a Christian, but my love for the Bible didn't stop when I ceased to be a Christian. And so I'm fascinated by the historical questions of how Christianity began, why it took the shape that it did, and just the development of the New Testament, why we have the texts that we have, every conceivable question under that umbrella. So that obviously intersects with apologetics, and those who try to demonstrate the truth of Christianity historically. And so that's why we're here tonight, to look at an apologetics book in that vein. I will say, the farther I get away from my deconstruction, I do find that the less energy I have for this kind of thing, just apologetics in general. I still find that I love biblical studies. I still find that I love the historical questions, but apologetics less and less. So I think us having this conversation is a labor of love. I think you just said that a minute ago, Dustin. So I think that's probably true for all of us. But I've got my whiskey to keep me sane. I've got my coffee to keep me awake, and I'm ready to go.
Nice. I have my mango White Claw with a little bit of Tito's vodka in it to keep me sane. So,
ooh,
hell yeah.
Wow.
Because as I said on the Deep Drinks podcast, I'm extremely manly, and that's the drink of my choice. But how about you, Ben?
Yeah, so both of my regular viewers know me as Ben the amateur exegete. So kind of like Matt, grew up Christian, spent most of my life that way, and then deconstructed, became an atheist. But still interested in the Bible, still interested in the text, especially not just the historical questions, but also how the texts function, how the stories work. I'm kind of starting to get into narrative criticism and things like that. But I find those questions fascinating. And they intersect with apologetics just because of how these texts tend to be treated, especially if they're considered to be eyewitness accounts or otherwise based in someone who was there. And I find that often it's at the expense of the story itself. And I have a problem with that. And so I'm really happy to be doing this with you guys.
And just so I know, Ben will probably plug it at some point, but I'll plug it at the beginning. He actually has a more in-depth book review of this book, Testimonies to the Truth, that I do in fact have, that I bought to read for some reason. We all bought this book. But so one of the things too is not everything we cover. Well, we all have different things we're going to bring to the table regarding this discussion, but some of the stuff that like Ben has made a lot of slides in preparation for this, and we're going to go through some of those slides. But I just want to say to anyone watching this, that's not all this. Like there's something even more in depth after this that's coming out. So,
I mean, don't hype it up too much.
I'm just saying, like people are going to have the pitchforks. They're going to be like, this you didn't cover every single thing after we have this conversation. Those slides weren't in depth enough. Well, guess what?
Yeah.
There's more stuff coming. Anyway, so to get the ball rolling, just to set the stage, let me go ahead and share. I have an amazing set of 3 slides. I don't know how many slides do you have, Ben?
I lost count. Is there a way to count 5, that? I just don't think it's possible.
Okay, so this is oh god. I just wanted to
70 times 7.
Oh Jesus.
153.
I just wanted to sort of set the stage about some of this. So, I had to put an emoji up there, but just because. So, why are we doing this? I mean, the major reason is that, Lydia McGrew is the most popular proponent of this approach to apologetics. And so I understand, like, there's some optics, like this is three dudes just, I guess, like dunking on this woman that people are going to be like, oh my God, like, but go listen to someone like Laura Robinson. There's other people talking about this who have dunked on Lydia McGrew. If this isn't your thing, the three of us dunking on Lydia McGrew, if you don't like that, then, or if that's not your thing, there's other people that have done it. Laura Robinson is one example. But yeah, so she is the most, prominent person that is putting this sort of apologetics forward. And as I say in the next bullet point, it is kind of annoying. And that kind of bleeds into so some of the reason it's, I think between us, the reasons that we think it's annoying are going to slightly differ, not complete. They're going to be, intersecting in some ways. Other than the fact that just the examples, I want to keep today focused more on the details, which is what Ben's slides are going to be going over, like the actual examples of undesigned coincidences. But there's also just for me specifically, as someone who's more interested in philosophy, which bleeds into the next. This is more about Bayesianism. Okay, so what is evidence? Okay, evidence. Lydia McGrew, the McGrews are Bayesians. McGlatchy is a Bayesian. Evidence is anything that raises the probability of a hypothesis, even if only slightly. And I know that anyone that is into the McGrews that is a Bayesian already knows that, and they're just like, okay, I already knew that. Why are you telling me this? The reason it's annoying is because it seems to me that the kind of way that this apologetics approach is put forward is sort of they're couching what they're trying to say in more intellectual entrapments than it's not as intellectually sound as they're trying to make it seem. And if someone's not like used to playing the language games of Bayes, then they're going to look at Lydia McGrew or someone and say like, all this stuff is evidence that the Gospels are reliable, and like what they're saying is like, oh, they got these cities right. Oh, like Jesus's character is the same, in these different. Okay, so that could be true, but like evidence, within a Bayesian framework, just as an example that I've used before many times. Again, I think the first time I heard it was from Ben Watkins, but I'm pretty sure he got it from Elliot Sober. Could be misremembering, but if someone has the hypothesis there's gremlins in my attic, and I hear banging in my attic, right? Okay, that's more expected on the gremlin hypothesis than the not gremlin hypothesis. And so trivially, that's like evidence. I mean, I don't mean to do this. It is evidence. It's evidence in a very slight way that there's gremlins up there. So the language game that's being played here about evidence, I think to the uninitiated is kind of, and again, that doesn't mean you should just change the way you're using language. But the problem I have with it, with like pop apologetics, is that like in philosophy, like philosophy of religion, people use evidence in this way. Everyone knows what everyone's talking about. But when you try to translate that into pop apologetics and then put that out to the masses, then all of a sudden you have things like, people will have, some pop journalists will say, some article, evidence for, X, Y, and Z. And then some person that doesn't know anything will be like, see, for whatever position they have. So my frustration is, it seems that, and again, it seems like some of this way of using language is being put down in pop apologetics to strengthen the faith of people that don't really know what they're saying completely all the time. And I would like to, again, I don't want to go on a rant about this. I have my own potential not projects, but I would like to get into that on my own and maybe make videos about that specifically. That's not what the focus of this stream is going to be. It's going to be more getting into the details rather than saying, okay, what if we grant them everything? What does that actually show? Because that's another question. There's two questions. One is, if we grant all of this, how far does it get them? And another question is, does their case even work in the first place to get you there? So that second thing is broadly what we're going to be discussing.
While we're just briefly on the subject of Bayes, because she doesn't really get into Bayes or even, more broadly her philosophical credentials. She doesn't really employ those a ton in this book, because this book is more just focused on specific arguments for the reliability of the Gospels. But I think it's important to contextualize Lydia McGrew's work over the last, little over a decade, to an article that her and her husband wrote for the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. They wrote this article in 2009, and it's, I say article, but it's a 75-page document that they wrote. And the title of it is "The Argument from Miracles: A Cumulative Case for the Resurrection of Jesus." And they employ a Bayesian argument for the probability of the resurrection of Jesus. But they, you can really kind of chart Lydia McGrew's whole career back to that. Her career in apologetics, back to that article. And it's a really interesting thing to look at that article and her subsequent publications, which this book that we're looking at today, Testimonies to the Truth, is kind of a primer, or just a almost like a Reader's Digest version of all of her works over the last decade plus, put into the most accessible form that she could. But that article, there are a lot of things that are really interesting about that article, but one of them is that her and her husband, they employ this argument that is, it's a lot like C.S. Lewis's trilemma, and it's, the form of the argument is, the disciples were either, mistaken, or they were lying, or they were telling the truth, and therefore, prima facie, we have to take the resurrection claims of the New Testament seriously. Like C.S. Lewis's trilemma, famously, C.S. Lewis's trilemma doesn't consider the possibility of legend, but Lydia and her husband Tim's version of the trilemma, which kind of uses that same form and applies it to the disciples, they in this article largely take for granted that what we have in the New Testament accounts of the resurrection pretty straightforwardly represent what the disciples themselves would have claimed about their experiences of the risen Jesus. And so they really don't take very seriously what is the majority position of most critical scholars. And they use this argument. They actually call on Gary Habermas. And this is really interesting, I think, to show their relationship to New Testament scholarship, current New Testament scholarship more broadly. But they rely on Gary Habermas in that article. And Gary Habermas has his minimal facts argument. And one of the most important parts of that minimal facts argument is the claim. The minimal facts argument, just for those who aren't familiar, is trying to make an argument for the resurrection based on what the vast majority of New Testament scholars, both believing and unbelieving, claim, would all agree to, the data that they would all agree to surrounding the resurrection of Jesus, or what the earliest Christians were claiming about the resurrection of Jesus. One of those, probably the most important of those minimal facts, is the appearances, but it's specifically the way that Habermas frames it, the way that it is most accurate in representing the vast majority of New Testament scholars, is to say that the disciples believed that they had witnessed in some, and it's tricky. It's really, really tricky whether you even include group appearances in that or just individual appearances, because what most New Testament scholars would actually grant in that, it varies. But to put it in its most modest form, is that some disciples claimed that they had all seen the risen Jesus, period. And that doesn't entail the narratives about the resurrection appearances that we find in the Gospels, which are much, very detailed, talking about, Jesus appearing to the disciples in the flesh and them touching his hands and his feet and eating food with him, et cetera, et cetera. That is not what what most scholars would grant. But the interesting thing about this article is that Lydia and Tim at the time thought that that was what Gary Habermas was claiming. And so a lot of the argument that they mount in that article is based on that assumption that the vast majority of New Testament scholars agree that what we have at the end of the Gospels, in the resurrection narratives of the Gospels, represents what the earliest Christians actually believed happened, down to the details, more or less. And that is not what Gary Habermas was claiming, and that's not what the vast majority of New Testament scholars would say by a long shot. But they were ignorant of that, and Lydia subsequently wrote a blog post talking about how she didn't understand that. They didn't understand that at the time. But when you actually read that article, what's interesting is that they make some very, very, very strident claims about New Testament scholarship and about the state of New Testament scholarship, and are very critical of some points. I mean, if I can just read this part real quick. They say in that article, they're talking about the attribution of the authorship of the Gospels to the traditional, ascribed authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they, acknowledge that most critical scholars today would not grant that the Gospels are actually written by the names that were ascribed to them. But they say that this fact is partly due to a fashionable fixation on literary analysis and a downplaying out of disciplinary insularity of patristic claims. And that kind of language is littered throughout this article that is very strident, very authoritative, very, reading the motives of these scholars who, the majority of scholars, when they have a position that is contrary to the position that they hold, but is trying to communicate that they really know the field. And that's something that carries through to all of Lydia McGrew's works. And I think a question that we're going to run into as we go throughout this, talking about this book, is how familiar is Lydia McGrew actually with the current state of New Testament scholarship? And we'll get into it, but I just want to put that on the table, because that is a pretty glaring omission. And they admitted that, we didn't really understand at the time that when Gary Habermas made this claim, that he wasn't actually saying that most New Testament scholars, agree that that what we have in the New Testament accounts is, what the disciples were actually claiming. So anyway, all of the work that she has done over the years since then has been to some extent energized by their realization that this wasn't what the minimal facts argument was really doing, and that it wasn't assuming or resting on the reliability of the gospel accounts of the resurrection more broadly. And so they have employed this, what they call the maximalist argument for the reliability of the resurrection. And this book about the reliability of the Gospels more generally is in service of that aim. But so I just wanted to contextualize it to that specifically.
That actually runs into my next slide, actually. So nice. Anyway, so I want to come back to what is evidence. The reason I brought this up, she didn't directly touch on Bayes, but she's still throwing around the word evidence, in all the chapters. And what I'm saying is that a regular Christian just reading this book that has no idea the framework with which she's coming at this with may not realize that what she means by evidence is way looser than what they might think she means by evidence. So that's why I'm saying within the framework of the McGrews, when they say like this is, I mean, obviously they think the cumulative case is strong and should be believable to people once they understand it. So I'm not saying that they don't think that. I'm just saying, just a Christian that just wants to hold on to their faith, and they're just like, and someone's just like, well, here's this, take this on your journey, this Lydia McGrew book, and they're just reading through the book, and they see evidence. They see the word being used over and over in these different chapters. I'm trying to contextualize. This is what they mean is not just saying something is evidence. Like when she says, Jesus's character is consistent. First of all, that's debatable. Second of all, even if that were true, that is like evidence in a very weak sense, unless you combine it with a lot of other evidence that you try to put in this cumulative case. So that's, anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but what I was going to say that ties into what Matthew said is, what's at stake? Here's a quote from near the end. This is, I think it is the last chapter of the book. And it has to do with, again, it kind of dovetails off of what Matthew is saying, so, quote, we need, the emphasis is mine here. When I italicize need multiple times, that is my emphasis, not hers. We need to have gospel reliability in portraying Jesus because of the command to commit to him and follow him. We need gospel reliability because of the call to tell others. If we want to tell others, inviting them to be ready to die for Jesus, we as Christians need to be prepared to present this case convincingly to the world, and that requires gospel reliability. So the reason I wanted to sort of, to me, one of the things I jotted down in my notes in the margins of this book was kind of like laying the cards on the table. In other words, like, the fact that she's motivated to defend this position doesn't mean it's false, but it's important to put this in like a wider framework, which is basically like, she's saying, basically, if the gospels aren't like as reliable as I think they need to be, my Christianity will fall apart, or Christianity is not true, basically, is what I gather her position is.
Which is such a strange thing to say, because think about all of Christian history, right? Think about the earliest followers of Jesus. They didn't have the fourfold gospel. Most of them didn't know anything about Jesus, probably. They heard by word of mouth different stories, probably stories that aren't even in the canonical gospels. Or in the case of Paul, as he says, they saw deeds of power, the power of God's pneuma. Well, I mean, it is such a strange thing to say you need to have the gospels be reliable, or else your Christianity is somehow less than. Man, it's just strange.
Well, I mean, I think her concern, to actually try to play devil's advocate, I think her concern is more to say, at least with this quote, maybe it's not as much, because I think there's a distinction between what someone's personally justified in believing within their own body of evidence, and what they can justifiably try to get other people to believe. And so I think what she's saying is like, my interpretation of Christianity is that like, this is the go tell the world, repent, like repent of your sins, or else, I don't know what her conception of hell is, but like, I think what she's saying is, hey, like, if this is going to work, the public evidence has to be good. It can't just be that, someone had a religious experience. So someone had a religious experience, and so therefore that person is justified in believing that Jesus is Lord or something like that. I think her concern is like, well, okay, maybe that personally justifies someone in believing, but how does that help? Well, her interpretation of Christianity is a very evangelistic one. So if you have a very evangelistic interpretation of Christianity, then I basically sort of agree with her, honestly. But you don't have to have that type of interpretation of Christianity. I just think it has to do with like, I think there's a distinction between what could be justify you personally in believing something. Like if someone's a more progressive Christian, I don't think they're necessarily being like irrational for being a Christian, even if they don't think that the public evidence is amazing. Where I do think I do draw kind of a line is to say, okay, other people are being like irrational for rejecting this because the public evidence is amazing. And so I think that the kind of Christianity she's a part of requires that the public evidence be amazing, or else it's false.
Yeah.
So that's what I just want to make that distinction because
it's really important for her version of Christianity. It's really important that history tells us the same thing as faith, and that there isn't any dissonance between them. That if you, as deep as you go into the probabilistic, evidence-based, criticism of the Gospels, if you're doing it correctly, it will show you the truth of Christianity. And that is, there's part of me that really admires that impetus in more like modernist evangelical forms of Christianity that are, because they're trying to take the challenge of the Enlightenment. They're trying to take the challenge of modernity, and to beat it at its own game in a way. But that the courage that is displayed in that is only really courageous if you are willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And that's where apologetics gets into trouble, and where what seems courageous in this kind of rhetoric, at first blush, becomes less than courageous when you find yourself cherry picking evidence, only using the evidence that really suits your conclusions, trying to leverage that one body of evidence over and against other pieces of evidence. And I think that's what we're going to run into here is to what extent is she really allowing all of the evidence to speak, and let the chips fall where they may, versus to what extent is she trying to zero in on these little pieces of evidence and let them kind of, overwhelm everything else. So, yeah.
I think the more animated you're getting, Matthew, like your camera's doing the thing again where it's kind of glitching out. So you must sit incredibly still while you're trying to make
He's moving faster than the speed of light. That's just
he's trying to.
He's like the Flash.
It's just, well, I do the same thing. Like if I'm talking, I just do hand movements, but I feel like it's just you must sit extremely still, or else we will not.
We'll see. We'll see if my internet stays. It'll be a sign that God is with this stream. And if it goes out, then I'll take that as a sign of God's judgment.
Well, I mean, honestly, most people this is going to be, I don't know. A lot of people listen to this kind of stuff on YouTube nowadays anyway, rather than watch every second of it. So it doesn't really matter. But
it's true.
Anyway, so I don't know if you wanted to, was there any, with any of the stuff that I think me and Matthew talked a lot, Ben, was there anything that you wanted to comment on before you actually want to share your slides while we go through? I mean, they're broadly, as we talked about before, it seems like we're not necessarily going to go, they're broadly chronological. I think we'll just, the framework of this is we'll just sort of let Ben present his slides and sort of jump in when we want.
Oh, yeah. No pressure. That's great.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, great. I mean, we'll jump in where we need to, but I mean, we'll use those as, you don't have to go through an entire presentation and then we talk. It could just be you could, as someone that's just presenting the information, you could say what do you have any feedback? This is organic. We'll just see how it goes. So
yeah, we'll just comment as we go. There's no point. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
But so let me see, okay. So you should be able to control that now.
Oh yeah. Okay. So yeah. So this is kind of the main, one of the main things I got from reading the book, especially the chapters on, the one chapter on harmonization. It's that if you're going to take the book Testimonies to the Truth and McGrew's work generally on the gospel seriously, the result is that you can't take the evangelists and what they've written seriously at all. So one of the first things she says, and this kind of the slide's a little messed up, but this is from page 7. And she says, the way that Luke tells the events in these chapters, and she's talking about the travel narrative in Luke's gospel, which is a unique feature of Luke. She says that the way Luke tells the events in these chapters is what I've called elsewhere a chronological narration. meaning narrating without intending to indicate a time ordering, which, and I don't know what you guys think, so this might be a good place to just stop for a second. I don't have any real objection to the idea of a chronological narration per se, because when you read the travel narrative in this section of Luke, there's places where you're thinking, well, how does this really fit? How does this get Jesus from the Galilee to Jerusalem? Like, it's not always clear cut. There's structure. Of course, that it's debated. If you read any kind of critical commentary, there's always debate on the structuring of Luke's gospel generally, but especially this section. But I don't have a huge objection to that language. Now, Matt, I know you probably. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's like so much in this book. The problem I have with it is often not so much the thing itself, but what she's doing with the thing. And first of all, I mean, I would just say, the fact that she is relying on this idea of a chronological narration is ironically very similar to the kind of stuff that Mike Lacona does in his book on what,
why are there differences in the Gospels?
Why are there differences in the Gospels, which is what she wrote a whole book against, against the literary devices. This I don't know the difference between this and what Mike Lacona is doing, because it seems like it's one literary device that she kind of had to let pass through in order to, because she couldn't find a way to harmonize Luke's chronology with John, really, and the framework that John gives of Jesus's ministry. And so she said, okay, well, in this one case, we will admit a literary device, but then she, I think, as you're going to say, what she does with that, and the kind of thus far but no further, it doesn't really fly. But,
what is it saying? Like literal where possible. I feel like there's like I forget, it's that kind of like sentiment, it seems to me. I forget the exact phrase, but it's
I know what you're talking about. So she continues, it's very important not to mistake this for changing the order of events in a non-factual way, making something happen at a time when the author knows that it didn't happen. And this is kind of the key line here. That would be misleading, and Luke doesn't do that, but sometimes he just chunks things in. So
why is she psychoanalyzing people? I just want to know why she's psychoanalyzing. I mean, you can't psychoanalyze people that lived a long time ago. I mean, duh.
That's true.
I don't know how. Anyway.
So let's look at, first of all, everything I say is going to be predicated on the assumption that Luke is in some form or fashion deriving some of his material from the Gospel of Mark. This is known as Markan priority. It is the consensus view among New Testament scholars, especially those scholars that work in the synoptics. This is just the consensus view. There's debate over, of course, if Luke used Matthew, which is the Ferrer hypothesis made popular by Mark Goodacre in more recent times. But so my assumption is Markan priority, and I think that's defensible. So I'm just going to start with that. But if you look at some of, like, this is a comparison of Markan chronology with Lucan chronology. Now, this doesn't hold for all of Luke, right? So I'm not saying that every aspect of Lucan chronology, just is right in line with Markan chronology. That's obviously not true. The travel narrative is an example. But if you look here, you can see over and again, Luke is following Mark, right? The cleansing of the leprous, the healing of the paralyzed man, the call of Levi, the controversy about fasting and about grain on the Sabbath, and the healing of a man with a withered hand. You see, of course, a couple of the passages are kind of transposed. Luke has moved Markan material, but overall, the chronology holds. And this makes sense on Markan priority. So it suggests to me, yes, Luke is using Mark as one of his sources, and he's using his chronology in this particular section to tell his story. So Luke knows Mark. Luke knows how Mark has written his story. He knows many of the order of events. So then we, so here's the rearrangement that Luke has made of Mark material. And this is the rejection at Nazareth. So the slide looks like it's a little cut off, but the left side is Mark's story. So the first story is, of course, Jesus returns to Galilee. He's baptized, right? He is tempted by Satan in the desert, and then he returns to Galilee, repent, believe the gospel, and so you have all these events, right? All these events that intervene between that scene and then in Mark chapter 6, where Jesus goes back to his hometown of Nazareth, and he's rejected by the people there. So, but if you look at Luke's chronology, now Luke has, of course, the birth narrative. He has, a genealogy. He has all that fun stuff. But when you get to the scene where Jesus returns to Galilee, what is the very next thing that happens? Now, if it was Mark, it'd be the call of Peter and Andrew and James and John. But that's not what Luke does. He has the rejection at Nazareth. He throws that in the front. Now, this is a problem because if Luke knows how Mark is telling his story, he's relying on Mark for this chronology. He trusts the chronology of Mark in this regard. Then when McGrew says that Luke doesn't do that kind of thing, he doesn't change material, he doesn't change the chronology of anything, we have a clear-cut example from the very beginning, the essential beginning of Jesus's ministry in the Lucan text. So Luke's obviously and deliberately moved the rejection scene to a much earlier place in his gospel. And let's go here. So here's the scene, and this is another reason we kind of know why Luke's gotten this from Mark. So notice in verse 16, it says, when he came to Nazareth. Did I put that in the next slide? Okay, here's Mark chapter 6.
Can I ask a question just to clarify? From what I understood her to mean by a chronological narration, specifically, on page 7, she says, it isn't clear that Luke even means us to think that this is all the same journey to Jerusalem. She's commenting on this long narrative where it seems like there's a bunch of stuff that is just kind of thrown in here and there that doesn't really have a precise chronology to it. And so the issue is that it's whether or not Luke intends for the reader to think that the order of events that he is narrating is actually the order of events as they actually happened. And so is that your understanding of it too? Because I mean, it seems like she's saying, yes, he does change the chronology. He does change the order of events, but the question is whether he is doing that and trying to tell the reader that actually the way that I'm ordering it is the way that it happened, or whether it's just and some things happened and some more things happened and some more things happened, and the chronology in this section doesn't really matter.
Well, this is
am
not
I understanding
from that.
It right?
Well, so yeah, so she's talking in general, like she's talking about the section, the travel narrative, right? Mm-hmm. But she makes this general principle about Luke's procedure in telling his story. Mm-hmm. So, and maybe I'm wrong on this. If that's the case, then I need to do some revising of some things. But my understanding is, if that's the case, we have examples from Luke's gospel where he knows chronology.
Yeah.
Like he's got this chronology set in his mind because he uses it elsewhere, but he's rearranged material. And not only has he rearranged material, but he has altered the material that he has rearranged because he's changed the chronology.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So like in this example, Jesus comes to Nazareth in Luke, but in Mark's gospel, who goes to Nazareth? is Jesus and his disciples. So what has Luke done? Well, Luke has moved the scene, but because he's moved the scene, he's had to rearrange the who shows up, and it's just Jesus and his story, because the disciples don't get called till what, chapter 5, I think it is, the next chapter. But we know that he gets it from Mark and chronology, because in verse number 23, Jesus is anticipating the what the crowd is going to say to him, and he says, doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, "Doctor, cure yourself," and you will say, "Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum." And of course, the difficulty there is Jesus hasn't done anything at Capernaum, right? In Luke's gospel, none of that has happened, but it did happen in Mark. So this is an example of editorial fatigue, right?
Yeah.
Where he started the story and he's got the details right. Jesus is by himself. The calling hasn't happened.
Yep.
But then as he laps into his source, all of a sudden Capernaum comes up.
Yep.
And so so we know he's getting this from Mark. It's just more evidence that he's got Mark in mind. He knows Mark. He's using Mark. But it goes against her claim that Luke does not rearrange material when he knows a chronology.
Yeah.
He has rearranged material. This is one example of there's a couple different examples.
Yeah. And that's, so for me, I'm like, the primary question that I was picking up from this is the question is do we, like, does the text itself suggest that Luke, in those instances in which he seems to be changing the chronology or just taking things from one place and putting them in another place, does the text suggest that he means for the reader to understand him to be saying this was the order in which these events happened or not? And she is very dogmatic in saying that no, Luke, in those places in which Luke does narrate things in a different order than we find them in the other Gospels, and specifically in Mark, in those places, Luke does not intend for the reader to take him as giving his own superseding chronology of those events. He's narrating chronologically. He's just saying, and this stuff happened, and this stuff happened, and this stuff happened. Chunks it in. The problem I have with that is that I don't see the only reason I really see for taking that position, as with so much in apologetics, is because you need it to be true. You need that to be the case. And this is an instance where, this literary device, and it is a literary device, is being employed in the same way that Mike Licona employs the literary device of apocalyptic symbolism when talking about the resurrection of the dead saints in Matthew 27. At the cross, saints come out of their graves, and then it says after the resurrection they were seen by many, and Mike Licona takes that to be a figure of speech. He takes that to be apocalyptic language. It's a literary device that isn't meaning to actually speak historically. It is pointing to that this is a it's just, I don't know what the analogy would be, or what the exact language that he uses, but is basically, he says Matthew in that case wasn't intending to say that this actually happened in time and space. And he didn't intend his readers to think that either. The problem with that is that he says, Matthew says the same kind of thing that he says with Jesus. It's that they were seen by many. And there's nothing in the text to suggest that this is just a figure of speech. And it seems like the only reason he's taking it to be just a figure of speech is because he needs that to be the case. He needs for Matthew to not intend for the reader to be taking this at face value, literally. And in this case, it seems to me like Lydia she's doing the exact same kind of thing. She is using this literary device of achronological narration to say, Luke doesn't intend for the reader to take these instances at face value as events that actually happen in sequential order, because if he did intend for the reader to take them that way, that presents us with a problem where we can't harmonize him with the other gospels, and we can't have that. So again, it's just like I don't have a problem with the idea of a chronological narration, but the way that you're using that to get the gospel writers off the hook of saying things that aren't actually true, and not, the question, did the gospel writers believe their own myths? That is the
Joel
question.
Marcus.
Joel Marcus. And yes, I think Matthew really did believe that the saints came out of their graves at the cross, and that's why he says that, is because he actually believed it. And I think Luke is writing his gospel intending it to supersede Mark. He's saying this is actually how things happen. This is more accurate. And I mean, the big example of this, which I think she gets to later in this chapter, I think, but is the way that Luke removes Galilee from the resurrection appearances and makes all of the resurrection appearances happen in and around Jerusalem. And there's a place where, a lot of scholars would think that Luke is using Mark, where Jesus said in Mark, I will go ahead of you to Galilee and I will meet you there. And Luke says, instead, remember when I was in Galilee, how I told you that I would, rise again and I would meet you, and then everything happens in Jerusalem. And he says, and don't leave the city, until you're endued with power from on high. And so everything takes place in Jerusalem and not in Galilee, like in the Synoptic Gospels. And she cites that as an example of critical scholars just going off into la land based on the one word Galilee, thinking that, redaction criticism gone wild of, that Luke is just, changing his source with it, and they don't have good reasons for thinking that. But it's not just the one word. There are many, many parallels to that statement in Mark, and the context that it happens in everything is the same, of the angel at the tomb saying to the women, referring back to Galilee, in order to speak of the resurrection of Jesus and how they're supposed to go ahead but it's just changed from Galilee being the place where he meets them to Galilee being the place where he told them he would, all this stuff would happen. But that's I think a prime example of a place where it really matters that is not Luke actually changing his sources, because that's a pretty glaring case of a change in a place where it matters most, the resurrection of Jesus. But if you're just reading Luke, and this goes back to your big point, is that if you take Lydia at her word, you can't take the gospel writers at their word. You can't actually read them and take seriously what they are saying. You have to play fast and loose with them in order to make them fit with each other. And
it's the problem with the puzzle analogy, right? Mm-hmm. It's not that the gospels can be put together to make one single coherent puzzle, that you can then glue the back of and put it on a wall. It's that you have 4 puzzles, but these puzzles are already put together. The evangelists have done the work already. You can't just take pieces out here and there and make a new puzzle. That's not how that works. You have to take the narratives seriously as the narratives that they are, and appreciate the internal consistency of those narratives. I mean, they're not perfect. I mean, what is, right? But they're very consistent. Like the example you just mentioned, right, where the Lucan angel tells them that, remember when I said in Galilee, and she has that huge problem with it. The difficulty, though, is what does Luke do to the reference in Mark chapter 14 when they're on their way to the Mount of Olives to Gethsemane? And Jesus says to them in Mark, he says, tonight, all of you are going to ditch me because it's written in Scripture. And then he says, but when I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee, and there you will see me.
Yep.
Where is that in Luke?
Yeah.
It's not there.
Yeah.
Why is it not there? Because it doesn't need to be, because in Luke's story, in his narrative, they don't go to Galilee. they stay in Jerusalem as Jesus commanded. It's consistent throughout. And in the Gospel of Matthew, the same thing. That scene appears. Where do the disciples see Jesus? They see him in Galilee, just as the angel and Jesus said, because it establishes not only Jesus and the angel as reliable communicators, but the evangelist himself. Because if you can't trust the evangelist, what good is the message?
Yeah.
And so what her apologetic fundamentally does is it undermines the reliability of the evangelist in a bid to preserve the reliability. Ironically, it's just a huge problem, and I don't, it's just, I don't know, but yeah, so. I've kind of jumped ahead a little, though. That's.
I mean, if you're going to cover a lot
good.
of what you got a lot out of your system right there. So, I mean, that's not bad.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Let's see. Well, this is the call of the first disciples, which Luke has moved. It's another thing. If you're going to claim, so this is the problem with a chronological narration. If you're looking at it from the perspective of the entirety of the Gospel of Luke, like Matt, you said, Luke is changing Mark, right? He's got Mark, but he's made changes. I mean, the preface to Luke's Gospel kind of makes this clear. He knew about his predecessors. He's going to make some updates, and you don't write a new gospel. You don't produce this new thing if you've got really good ones already that are just fine. You write them because, hey, I've got these other traditions. I have this other knowledge. We need to update this account to make more sense. And I think Luke does that, and I think if you take him seriously as a narrator, then you have no choice but to say he doesn't agree with Mark, and it contradicts, and that's okay because they can do that,
Yeah, and that's something a point that Lydia often goes back to. She often speaks of, that if like the gospel writers, willingly contradict each other, then they are creating problems, and they wouldn't, like, if they were, because she mischaracterizes scholarship as, presenting the gospels as hoaxers. I mean, that's the opening line of the first chapter is specific locations are hard on hoaxers. And she uses this straw man of the gospel writers as hoaxers, as if New Testament scholars actually that is a mainstream position, but that they are deliberately trying to craft a narrative that they know to be false, and to kind of pull the wool over the eyes of their audience. But she says one of the many points that she makes against that straw man is to say, well, if they were doing that, then you'd think that they would have tried to do a better job of making their stories agree with each other. As if kind of the gospel writers were like, as if Luke was writing and Mark was already canonized or something. Mark was already, held as being the infallible word of God that told us the gospel truth about Jesus, and that was held in such a place of high esteem throughout the entire, early church that nobody could change it. And that is a very anachronistic way of looking at the situation in the first century, or when Luke wrote. And it's just not the case that is how the gospel writers saw things. And I think the textual evidence that we have of the changes that took place in the texts that we have shows that they were pretty fluid for a while. And the synoptic problem in general points to this conclusion that they were copying and pasting to create new documents that they saw as superseding the old documents, as being more complete, better. And they weren't just saying like, oh, okay, I'm going to supplement that other thing. And, that is obviously canon, but I'm gonna like write something out like that. So anyway, yeah.
Well, it's just
Oh,
it's
yeah,
annoying. It's annoying to me that, I mean, just I don't think, obviously I don't buy into her simple binaries about, like, you know, it's like either the gospel writers are telling the truth or they're hoaxers or something. I don't like, obviously that's not true, but it is annoying where she makes statements like, you know, details are difficult for hoaxers, and it's like, okay, it's like you're saying that someone that's a liar. I don't think the gospel writers are liars, but like, to say that, like, detail, you know, obviously you don't know that many people that lie if you don't think that people don't add detail on purpose into the story to make their story more believable. So like
especially details that you can't verify.
Exactly.
Like,
so
there's, you know,
it just blows my mind that a lot of, I mean, I forget, maybe I haven't looked over the book. I read it, you know, a while back, but I haven't looked over it like extensively, covered every single page. So maybe she, said something about that objection. But just to me, in my experience, the people that I have known who have been serial liars are the people that add tons of detail into the story, but not the people that just bare bones it. So just all these comments over and over about, like, oh, like, you know, all these details show that they couldn't have been making it up. And I'm just like, do you live in the world? Like, I just don't. Anyway, I'm not saying that the gospel writers are just lying. I'm just saying some of the ways that she defends her binaries don't work.
I think that's a big problem with trilemma type arguments in general, is that they tend to have a very naive kind of folk view of human psychology that is extremely black and white, like you said, extremely binary. But the idea, and I think that this is to some extent baked into the language of lying and liars, that because the language of lying kind of the image that you get of someone lying is someone who knows the story that they are telling to be false, that they are consciously deceiving others when they know that the story that they are telling on a conscious level is not true. And I think far more often, or at least as often, as people deliberately telling falsehoods that they know to be false in order to, you know, the line between a grifter and a true believer is much grayer than we make it out to be. And I think there's a book by an evolutionary psychologist, Robert Trivers, called The Folly of Fools. And it's an excellent book, but he in that talks about the evolutionary function of deceit and how self-deceit is beneficial to an organism for the sake of deceiving others. That if you can convince yourself of the truth of a falsehood, then you become a more convincing propagator of that falsehood to others. And so but I think that it's just, I think if you look at somebody, and this maybe is getting too far into the weeds, but look at somebody like Trump and the question of whether or not Trump believes what, the constant, just stream of untruths that he says. I think that in asking that question and in trying to get into Trump's mind is to some extent already operating within an epistemology that is assuming that he even cares, that he is living in a world where truth matters, in the sense that, like, people who act like philosophers care that about truth. And for someone like that, it's Pilate. It's, what is truth? Truth is whatever can get me what I want. And he has realized throughout his life that what serves his ends best is to have his epistemology grounded in whatever serves his pragmatic ends of power. and convincing his audience. And that's often, I think, the case with cult leaders or, personalities. I mean, Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs has a whole chapter about the reality distortion field. And, oftentimes, Steve Jobs, he had this reality distortion field that it was his ability to believe his own stories and get other people to believe his own stories that in part was why Apple succeeded. But anyway, all of that is just to say that this like really simplistic binary that we have about, were they mistaken? Were they liars? Or were they telling the truth? Were they hoaxers? Like, it's just, it's way too overly simplistic when I think just do a little self-reflection about the times when you have told things that on deeper, more serious reflection, you realized, oh, that was an exaggeration. Oh, that wasn't entirely truth, but in the moment I was just caught up in the story or whatever, and I added this detail or whatever. Like, I think anybody who is really honest with themselves has to recognize that, like, it's really easy in the moment to exaggerate or to say things that aren't true in the service of a story that you think is grounded in truth, or there whatever. Like, and anyway, like,
well, I think that probably becomes more of an issue the more sort of power and feedback someone gets. So like there's that human proclivity, but then there's someone like Trump or Steve Jobs who almost become like worshipped in a way, and so like it's like they start to believe their own press, and so it's like a feedback loop where it makes them believe their own, like, their shit doesn't stink even more because like all these other people don't think it stinks, so
it's how are the incentives set up, and the more incentive that you have to like tell a story and whether that story is true or not, that you also then have the incentive to believe that story, whether it's true or not. And
anyway, I don't want to go too far afield. I feel like we've gotten a little off path, but bring us back, Ben, to your other slides.
Yeah, so we can skip ahead a little bit, but I think there's some important implications for kind of her view on the Gospels and the so-called reportage model. So on the traditional view, of course, Mark is the interpreter of Peter, so everything in the Gospel of Mark is authenticated by Peter, right? But so Peter is the essential eyewitness who stands behind the account. But if that's the case, then why doesn't he mention some of the details that Luke does? We didn't go over this, but really quickly, if you read the story of the rejection in Mark's gospel and then compare it with the Gospel of Luke, they're broadly the same story, but there are really big differences between them, right? So Jesus can read in Greek, apparently. He's a really clever, kind of preacher. At the end of the story, in Luke's gospel, the people of Nazareth try to kill him by throwing him off a cliff. That's not in Mark's gospel. I mean, that'd be a pretty cool thing to report, especially if it's the case that Peter was there. Why wouldn't he, record that reaction? But of course, in Luke's account, Peter's not there, right? Because he's not been called. But that's a different issue. And then, so if there is this kind of rearrangement, right, where Luke knows Mark, and Luke has deliberately moved the scene because he's got this, and this is another thing we didn't touch on, but in my review of McGrew's book, I'll talk about this, and that'll come out hopefully within the next couple weeks. But Luke has a reason for moving the scene, the rejection scene. He's got a very good reason for doing it. It has to do with the theme of like Gentile inclusion. The contents of the sermon have to do with that. So he's got reasons for doing this. But if that's the case, then wouldn't, on McGrew's view, make Luke an unreliable historian, right? He's a reliable narrator as far as I'm concerned because of the consistency of the gospel itself, but she takes a very different view of what the gospels are. And so this would, in my mind, it would speak to Luke's unreliability. He can throw stuff in wherever he wants in the travel narrative, That's fine. But there's places where he moves stuff in such a way that says he doesn't think Mark was right about this. He thinks this went differently than what Mark says. But if the authority standing behind Mark is Peter, and that's the whole intention of Papias's remarks when he says that Mark is the interpreter of Peter, is to say Peter authorizes this account. It's not just Mark, who's this nobody, didn't know Jesus. Peter's behind it. If that's the case, then, somebody's got to be unreliable. Either Peter, the eyewitness, or whatever Luke's sources were, whoever they might have been. I kind of lost my train of thought there for a second. Let's see. I think we kind of hit on that. So again, to take McGrew's work seriously, you just can't take the Gospels seriously. I don't see how you can do that.
I'd like to just make a couple side notes about that first chapter, which the subject of the first chapter is locations, just that the Gospels give specific locations, and specific locations are hard for hoaxers if they're writing long after the fact, if they don't, if they're trying to fool an audience, if it's just Spider-Man comics or whatever, then they wouldn't get the specific details of locations accurately like the Gospel writers do. But some just things that stood out to me. One on page 8, which later on, I think it's in the next chapter, that she really gets into maybe 2 chapters, gets into the synoptic problem, talks about mark and priority, and addresses the charge that her critics have made that she doesn't really understand the synoptic problem, and she doesn't understand mark and priority. And she I'm sure we'll have a lot to say when we get to that part. But here on page 8, she's talking about this location, Perea, and she notes all 3 of the other Gospels, and she's talking about Luke in context here, but she's saying all 3 of the other Gospels, meaning Matthew, Mark, and John. All 3 of the other Gospels confirm that shortly before his death, Jesus spent time east of the Jordan River in Perea, though they don't use that name. See Matthew, and this is just the point I want to make here, is her citations of the other Gospels. It says, see Matthew 19:1, Mark 10:1, John 10:40-41, and John 11-54. Matthew 19:1 and Mark 10:1 are the exact same text. And per mark and priority, Matthew is just pulling that from Mark. He is literally just copying and pasting Mark there. So if we're talking about independent traditions here, the force of what she's saying is that all 3 of the other Gospels confirm this location as Luke is talking about here. But synoptic problem, mark and priority, Matthew's just pulling from Mark. And as is, common in more traditional, non-scholarly work, she cites Matthew before Mark, whereas the common practice in more scholarly informed literature would be to cite Mark before Matthew. And that may seem like a small point, but it is, she is at pains later on in the book to say, no, I understand the synoptic problem. I understand mark and priority. People say I don't get it, but I absolutely get it. But this whole sentence and her citations here just really beg the question, do you really get what's going on here? And you citing these as being independent witnesses to this location when Matthew is just the exact same thing with the exact same wording as Mark, and you listing Matthew before Mark, it really does beg the question whether you really do understand mark and priority, and whether you really do understand the synoptic problem in general. On page 11, she says, this This is another, point about just her understanding of scholarship generally. She says she often just cites scholarship from the 19th century, and much, if you go through her bibliography, there's very little from current scholarship. There's a lot from 19th century apologetics and 19th century counter-apologetics. And obviously, I mean, a lot of what she is doing is resurrecting older arguments, but the question is, to what extent do you really understand the state of scholarship today? And she interacts with this skeptic. She says, it should have caused significant embarrassment. Actually, this is on the end of page 10. She's talking about the Pool of Bethesda and how it was discovered. And, earlier critics like Alfred Louisi once thought it didn't exist, which is debatable. I went and I looked at the reference, and it seems like that's not what Alfred Louisi was saying at all. You had to translate it from French, and I don't know if she really did all that, or if she was just, doing what apologetics authors often do, is just some earlier apologetic author made a claim, and so you're just relying on that claim of that earlier apologist and not really reading the texts themselves. But anyway, she says it should have caused significant embarrassment for all such critics when excavations later in the same century found the remains of the pool itself. Archaeologists could tell that it had been bound by 4 porticos around it and one across the middle. So as it turns out, John doesn't invent these things. He knew that the pool was there and mentioned simply and casually as a fact that it had 5 porticos. Here it's worth noting that these structures were broken down when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. So just at this earlier sentence, she has a footnote, and she cites an apologetic book from Thomas Nelson Publishers in 1984. And that's, again, citations, if you want to show that you understand the current state of scholarship, you're referring to 19th century, early 20th century critical scholarship, nothing current. And then to combat that, you're citing an apologetics book published in 1984, not a current scholarly work. And it's just, that looks bad. On the same page, she goes into this section talking about the Sea of Galilee, and this is something where she has often been criticized of reading the Gospels in a very wooden, literalistic, kind of photorealistic way. And she says, no, I don't believe in inerrancy, so I don't read the Gospels as being, photorealistic, as if, you could put a tape recorder there and, this is exactly what happened. But then she goes into things like this, where she's talking about the Sea of Galilee and John's account of the talking about the Sea of Galilee. John also takes note of a specific detail in the story of Jesus walking on the water. He says that they had rowed about 25 or 30 stadia, about 3 or 4 miles, John 6:19, in the storm when they saw Jesus coming toward them on the water. Mark 6:47 says that Jesus was on the land when they were in the middle of the sea. John's familiarity with the Sea of Galilee is evident in his taking note of about how far they had rowed, even under these circumstances. She has a footnote there and says, while it is true that the Sea of Galilee is about 7 miles across at its widest point, John may have not been implying that width here, since the disciples were probably not trying to row across at the widest point and had doubtless been blown off course away in the storm. And this is, I mean, she calls this kind of thing just, thinking with, historical creativity. But really, it's just taking the gospel accounts as being more or less photorealistic memories of what happened, and down to the details, down to the most minute points, and then harmonizing them in such a way. And this, we'll probably find more examples of this later on. But it's just this is the craziest photorealistic kind of positivistic way of thinking about an ancient historical events with where the sources that we're relying on are decades removed from those events. Even if you're just talking about a memory, if I'm talking about a memory that I had last week, to like talk with that this kind of precision and to try to like nail down the, you know, exact, like it's just that's not how this stuff works.
Well, I have a couple things I want to say. I mean, one is it seems like she's assuming that everyone's like I do agree that there's some people that probably have memory that works for them in a very more specific way, but like people are different across like their personalities and the way they perceive the world, and just to assume like it's almost like she's projecting maybe she's a person who her memory kind of works like that. So it's like maybe she's really good at like remembering what she ate for breakfast a week ago. I'm not. Well, first of all, I don't typically eat breakfast, but like just remembering meals that I ate, you know, a certain amount I don't know. Like so my memory doesn't work like that. So I think some of this probably has to do with like a little bit of projection, but it's interesting about like the photorealism, because like you said, you gave an example where she's kind of talking, it's like she's like, no, like I'm not really like putting forward this photorealistic thing, and then she like sort of does it. And then there's other times where she'll like say something like that, like on page 185. Again, for anyone that hasn't read this book, to me, like the last chapter, I don't know, like it was very important like it just seems very important for the message of the book. But on page 185, sort of like a third of the way down the page, well, actually like a little bit less than that, she said, you know, Jesus' teachings are important for our personal devotion. In the same chapter, Jesus told the crowds that his sheep hear his voice and know him, and that no man will take them out of his hands. These are rich teachings and comforting ones. We need to be confident that if we had been standing there and had known the language, we could have recognized this saying on Jesus's lips. And then so she just says this, and then like the next sentence, she's like, to be sure, this does not mean that every word is recorded verbatim. You know, so it's like she says this like, you know, sort of bold claim, and then sort of walks it back. And then there's other times where you just gave an example where she's like, no, I don't really mean photorealism, but then she just like sort of, and again, like not literally photorealism, because obviously she goes on to say something like, you know, like she basically says like it doesn't have to be verbatim, but it's like, you know, you're playing footsies with it enough that it's kind of like, even if you're letting a little wiggle room, it's still close enough that it's like, okay, this is kind of untenable. Anyway.
Yeah, that really comes up a lot in the chapter on undesigned coincidences. And I'm tempted to just give another example, because there are even more, I think, egregious examples of that, but maybe we should just wait until we get to that chapter. Do we have anything else to talk about in that first chapter on locations? Probably move on.
Oh yeah, I mean, we can move on to, I don't know, again, I don't know how Ben's slides sort of, you know, comport to all the chapters, but just let's keep going through Ben's slides and just see where we go.
Yeah, I didn't really touch much on the location stuff, mainly because some of it was just so uninteresting, right? Like I just like the section on Gethsemane. What? Like why? I would have left that out completely. I don't know.
Which is an issue in general with this book. I was really surprised, because I assumed that because this is meant to be the primer, like that is giving kind of the tip of the iceberg of her arguments, that she goes into a much more length in her other books. I assumed that this would kind of be the cream of the crop, and it would be the most interesting and compelling examples that she would be drawing on. And so many of these examples are just really lackluster.
That's the word I was going to use, lackluster.
To the extent that they are, you know, unobjectionable, they're really boring and they don't really demonstrate anything. And then to the extent that they're interesting, they're wrong.
That's true. That's true. Okay, so that tickled me a little bit. Okay, so this is from page 56. She's talking about, this is the undesigned coincidence chapter.
Okay, so we want to skip the chapter on customs and culture.
Let's just
we can hit that. I'm just
okay.
Let's just do. I would say let's just go with Ben's slides, and then afterwards, if we want to sort of flip through and see any other like overall points we want to do, then let's do that, because I don't want to like destroy the continuity of the slides by just you know because there's obviously like two stories here. Like there's two separate things. We need to keep these things separate. We can't harmonize them together. You know, we need to make sure that we need to make sure that Lydia McGrew, you know, tells her own story within its own, you know, context, and Ben with his slide. Anyway, so yeah, let's do the slides, and then we can sort of like sort of flip through the book, because I know we probably underline stuff, and if there's just observations that we have, we can sort of do like go ahead.
A lot of my stuff ends up being like, look at the specific words that these evangelists are using, the way they use them, the narrative they tell. So that's kind of like, that's my focus. But so here's page 56. At most, an argument from similar wording might lead us to conclude that Matthew or Luke borrowed some wording from Mark. Fair enough.
So
but
here's she's discussing the issue of marking priority and the synoptic problem.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But it does follow that they had no additional factual information about what happened in that incident. Not even close. In fact, since Matthew was a disciple and Mark wasn't, it would be very strange to assume that if Matthew tells a story found in Mark, he doesn't have any other information. So there's first of all, this sounds like a way to sneak in the argument for Matthean priority, which she flirts with quite a bit. But also, it's just not true, right? So here's the classic example. I think Laura Robinson has used this before, but this is the call of Matthew, and these slides are horrible because the way they transferred it up and uploaded. But you can see there's a lot of similar wording between Matthew and Mark, right? You have similar verbs, you have similar, just the language is very similar. So this begs the question, though, if Matthew is an eyewitness, right? He's on the ground. Why is he, in the description of his own calling by Jesus, something that would have been vivid to him, something that would have been just stuck out in his mind, why does he just use Mark's wording and change the name? And that's, essentially it. Why would he do that? That makes no sense. So when she says, they would, wouldn't they add more details? Well, he doesn't. In fact, Matthew takes away a detail because in Mark's account, Jesus is walking by the Sea of Galilee when he spots Levi. Well, not in Matthew. Matthew changes that entirely. That scene does not happen in that way. So he's actually removing detail where you would expect on McGrew's view that it would be there. But also, one of the arguments sometimes you'll hear for Matthean priority is that, or not an argument necessarily, but just in looking at the redaction profile of Mark on the assumption of Matthean priority, is that Mark is the abbreviator, right? In fact, this is one of Augustine's ideas. This is Mark is abbreviating Matthew and Luke. But that, if you actually compare the pericopes, when you actually sit down and compare many of the scenes in Mark and Matthew, Mark has way more detail, considerably more detail. It's the opposite of what you would expect. So when McGrew says that, these evangelists will throw in their own details, even if they're borrowing from Mark, yeah, they do, but they also really abbreviate the stories, especially Matthew. Matthew has this has this tendency quite a bit. So let me see. I think I have another example. Let's see. Oh, that's the Reportage model. Oh, no. Well, I don't want to get into that yet. I thought I had another example, but it does call into question the Reportage model, right? Because if why is Matthew just borrowing the story if he's an eyewitness? Why is Mark more detailed? Why does he situate the scene differently? Is this Peter's authentic memory? Let's see. Yeah, so just in general, why is Matthew taking it directly from Mark? Why isn't he just adding more details? Why doesn't he talk about his inner disposition? Why doesn't he talk about maybe the reasons he chose to? Because the calling is so terse, right? It's just follow me. Well, why doesn't he explain why he followed him? That would be something that might be interesting. or compelling to a reader. Why doesn't he do this? Why does he just follow Mark in every essential aspect of the story except the name? Trying to back up and see.
I mean, just from sorry, I want to say, I feel like the synoptic problem, just in terms of the kind of Christianity that wants to make this publicly, like the evidence is super publicly good. You could almost sort of give this sort of a hiddenness spin and say, like question, okay, God wants to draw these people to himself through this amazing public evidence. How's he going to do that? Well, these texts are going to be copying each other verbatim a ton. And like, this is what? Like, I mean, I don't get, like, what's the excuse? Okay, well, some of this was a common practice back then. They copied stuff, or what all the different excuses they make. But it's just like, just zooming out. This is the one. Okay, you're saying this is the one true religion, and like the one in all the accounts that you are using to corroborate this are like not independent sources in the traditional way that you would expect independent sources to work. And obviously, there's different sources behind the sources, and we don't have to get into that necessarily. But like, it's just. It seems like a strange way, or like the kind of God that these people believe in, to try to make this amazing public evidence be amazing, is to just have people copying each other.
Look at what they say about the Gospel of John, right? They say God, John has such a unique perspective, right? And this is indicative of his role or his identity as an eyewitness. But they can't use that argument for Matthew at all. Like, why do they get to have it both ways? The uniqueness of John is testimony to the eyewitness. Yeah, he's an eyewitness, but it's not. But what about Matthew? It's a frustrating apologetic because it's just so inconsistent. So I don't know.
I want to make a comment just about undesigned coincidences in general, because this is one of the major pillars of the maximalist case for the reliability of the Gospels, for the reliability of the resurrection. I mean, just to give like the definition, I think it's important that the definition that she gives of an undesigned coincidence. An undesigned coincidence is where two or more things come together, they fit with each other, they coincide, but without the authors trying to make it happen that way. An undesigned coincidence is a casual interlocking that points to truth. And I think the argument from undesigned coincidences, or I would say not the argument from undesigned coincidences, but undesigned coincidences in and of themselves, I don't find in principle objectionable. And you can even find scholars, like I sent you recently a clip of Dale Allison making a comment about the book of Acts. And obviously, I mean, the interlockings between Acts and Paul's epistles are, the place that is, some of the, most fruitful fodder for finding undesigned coincidences. And it's, I think, where the argument originally came from in William Paley's work. But even Dale Allison, would find some undesigned coincidences, but obviously he doesn't then, use those as this kind of overarching apologetic to say, therefore, the Gospels are overwhelmingly trustworthy. And that is my problem with undesigned coincidences, and with all of the arguments in this book, is not the things in themselves, but it's this this argument that is being made from them, that it's, okay, we find all these places where there's this casual interlocking of these things that point to truth. And I don't know how you use those details to the extent that those details are true. Maybe they point to there being reliable testimony of some details behind these sources. How do you use that to argue for the overall reliability of these documents? And that's the thing, is that they use this argument. The maximalist case is supposed to be in contrast to what they call a pericope by pericope approach, or a passage by passage approach that analyzes individual pericopes and says whether or not, based on the criteria of authenticity, we can, say, is this more likely to be to go back to Jesus, or to go back to early tradition, or is it less likely to go back to early tradition? They don't like that pericope by pericope approach. They want to make an overall argument for the reliability of the Gospels, but in order to do that, they have to themselves make these more atomistic arguments based on these specific details, and so they are interested in this close-up analysis of these individual things, but they want to use their data and leverage that data that points to there being eyewitness testimony, or stuff that's close up to the facts here, and make that data cancel out all of the other data that points to problems.
What you don't understand, Matthew, is that a guy came back to life and floated into the sky because some people got some locations right. I don't think you're following the amazing logic here. But I mean, and that's another thing too, is like in line with some of what you're saying. If we're going to play the game of judging it based on like the total reliability, okay, so if getting a location right means that like that's a slight boost in the probability that like the whole thing is accurate, saying that someone came back to life is a big hit for the whole thing being accurate. So if we're gonna play this tit for tat game about like, okay, so what weighs on the scales more? Okay, we're gonna say we're gonna judge this overall, right? Okay, there's some okay, it seems like they know some locations. It seems like based on my weird construction, all these characters have the same personalities, throughout whatever. But then they make you turn water into wine and these other. So if we're gonna play the game of just try to say, okay, this over here makes it seem like it's probable that it's all accurate. This over here, if we're gonna play that game, makes it seem like it's all inaccurate. So it's if you're gonna play their game, it seems like that. It seems like it could backfire if you look at it a certain way.
Yeah.
Anyway,
and my main thing is just that I'm not against the undesigned coincidence in principle. I think that there are some examples that I'm like, yeah, that looks like it might be an undesigned coincidence. And when I let that through, what that says to me is, at most, this detail goes back to very early tradition. And I don't know how you can really say more than that. And what it seems like they want to do is say it goes back, it's like, how do you get past it being, this detail, this part of this story being early tradition, to it being eyewitness testimony, to it being an accurate representation of the facts, or there be every other part of that story being reliable. And what McGrew, I've heard her say, I think I've heard Tim say this, and I've heard Eric Manning say this as well, is that, well, ultimately what we're arguing is that the gospel writers aren't schizophrenic. We're arguing that they aren't, really accurate 1 minute and then really glaringly inaccurate the next minute.
That sounds like psychoanalysis. That sounds like
psychoanalysis. It's arguing against this kind of view of human psychology that is just, grossly at odds with yourself or drastically inconsistent. How can you be super reliable 1 second and then super unreliable the next second? And I mean, and this is a point where I think where the rubber really meets the road. And I'm just like, I just look at human beings all the time, and all I see is inconsistencies. All I see is that we contain multitudes. I look at myself, I contain multitudes. I am a very inconsistent person. And I don't know, there's something in my history that was really influential to me as I was coming out of the cult that I was in, because people often made arguments for the authority of the stories that we lived under in this cult that I was in, and because there was a lot of really dramatic claims about how God moved, the prophetic words, healings, the angel Gabriel appeared, and dramatic confirmations with signs and wonders and all these things that were meant to. These stories were meant to confirm the authority of the movement and the authority of the leader. And for a long time, it was, well, I can't doubt their sincerity. They're clearly sincere. I mean, they're living these extreme lives of devotion where, I mean, it's not like these people weren't making tons of money. They were living, lives of, like fasting the majority of the time, driving a 30-year-old Oldsmobile, living in a duplex, and anyway, so it's like, I could run those same kinds of, trilemmas on them, and it was impossible to find a flaw if you were going to argue in that kind of way. But the problem was this need to have a completely unified view of someone where you couldn't allow for the complexity of actual humanity. And it's the fact that people are complicated, and they aren't just monolithic, that if you are determined that that people have to be completely consistent, and that the world has to be completely consistent, you're going to then set yourself up to have to be reducing your dissonance and rationalizing all of the inconsistencies, and doing exactly what I think this apologetic argument does. And that's, call on all these points of data in favor of the reliability of a thing, in favor of the goodness of a thing, in favor of the truth of a thing, to cancel out all of the other data, instead of just letting it all exist hand in hand and saying, yeah, it's complicated. This thing can be accurate in these ways, and it can be wildly inaccurate in other ways. And to me, that's just, a point going down to the foundations of this whole argument, where I just see, okay, that's a fundamentally different view of human psychology, that I think gets at the root of some of our differences here. And yes, you call it schizophrenic, and I'm just like, well, that's just human nature. I'm sorry.
Yep, I think you're right on that. I think they just expect more of the evangelists than probably even the evangelists themselves expected. Yeah. It just seems like it's you want too much out of sources that are just dealing with ancient sources is hard enough as it is, right? Reading Herodotus, reading Plutarch, it's always tough to read. These are historians who that was their that was their job, right? They were intent on doing that. But the evangelists, we don't know a whole lot about them, right? We don't know, even if you assume that Matthew wrote Matthew, but what does it really tell us? He worked at a toll booth. That doesn't give us any purchase on much of anything. How do we know about his method of research or his, just things about him in general? We have to have some kind of humility when it comes to evaluating any ancient source, including the Gospels. Heck, you look at the Apostle Paul. We know quite a bit about Paul, right? Paul is often inconsistent and all over the place on things. He's got huge expectations. Like one minute he'll say, like in 1 Thessalonians, we're going to be caught up together in the clouds. He emphasizes this we. And then the next chapter he's like, well, maybe not. It might be different. And this is somebody that we have firsthand account from, but the Gospels aren't like that. Matthew's not telling us anything from his unique perspective. He's not giving us any of his inner psychology. So for anyone to say they are consistent, they are not schizophrenic, you're overstating the case. Mm-hmm. Clear cut, and it ends up making it a very, very weak, very, very susceptible. Like it's very easily to undermine that kind of an argument, which is why I don't find the maximal data approach appealing at all. I just, if I had to do anything, I'd go minimal facts, and I don't find that very well, very good either. So,
just go. I feel like you could do I feel like the most, and I've said this before, I feel like the more, and I don't want to like, I would say like the more honest approach to being a Christian. I don't mean that every single person that, you know, thinks they have strong evidence is being dishonest. I'm just saying like, I'm not using it in that way, but I think it's better to start with like a spiritual experience and then see the minimal facts and then be like, okay, that fits what I already have experienced, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so like, but again, if you do that, I think the kind of Christianity you should hold to is not the same kind of, you know, super evangelistic Christianity that a lot of people end up holding to, because of the foundations with which you're basing it on.
Yeah.
But yeah, to me, like you could start with, I have some kind of experience. This seems true to me, and oh look, there's also these minimal facts that seem to be consistent with my experience, and that doesn't prove that, you know, maybe I can't prove that to anyone else, but that sort of corroborates what I've already experienced. So I don't think being a Christian like that is like horrible and evil. I just think that that kind of Christianity shouldn't be the foundation. Like that shouldn't be the foundation with which you stand on to then be like, everyone that disagrees is like going to hell, or, you know, you must believe this, or else you're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness because, you know, Paul wrote a thing, you know, and also by the way, he thought Jesus was coming back in his lifetime, and was wrong about that. But anyway, he's probably wrong about lots of stuff. So
exactly, yeah. Yeah, it's like I called Paul a jerk on YouTube. I posted this on Twitter, and I had a commenter say, "Well, if you're calling Paul a jerk, then you're basically, you know, casting aspersions on Jesus, the Son of God, because Jesus called Paul to be a minister." And I was like, "Well, okay, that's fine." But I mean, if we're not willing to let these authors be humans, what good is anything? Like, what? I mean, it just kind of reminds me of how I grew up as a King James onlyist, that, you know, you have this view of the Bible that basically it falls down from heaven in 1611, you know, and what, like, we can't question it. We can't interrogate it. We can't, you know, we can't go back further. We can't, it doesn't work for me anymore. Like, these are human beings writing stories. They no doubt thought they were writing true stories. They no doubt had experiences that I will never have, you know, but that doesn't then mean that they are suddenly these 100% infallible, inerrant individuals. We have to interrogate them. We have to examine them as with the tools that we have. I just, you know, this. Oh, I don't know.
I want to just talk a little bit, if we can, about the section on the synoptic problem. Just some of the things that she says in trying to, you know, defend her accurate understanding of the synoptic problem. She tries to, you know, talk about, you know, what the synoptic problem is, what Markan priority is in their most minimal form, and then you know, say what she agrees with, say, you know, where she differs from skeptics. But on page 54, she's talking about Q, and Q, you know, sometimes called the two source hypothesis, is you know, the idea that there's the material that Matthew and Luke both get from Mark, but then there's material where Matthew and Luke agree without Mark. There is no Markan parallel to shared material between Matthew and Luke. And that is, you know, where scholars who argue for the existence of Q, they argue for the existence of this document that consisted largely of the shared material, which is mostly sayings, but these sayings that Matthew and Luke shared that they didn't get from Mark is this other third source. And there are more rigid views of Q where, okay, Q is this one document, and then some scholars try to get, you know, really detailed and, you know, give verses and, you know, chapters and everything to Q and try to make a really complete kind of version of Q. And then they'll get to, you know, really extreme and hypothesize different levels of of different editions of Q, different earlier versions of Q and later versions of Q. But at its most minimal form, Q is just the shared material between Matthew and Luke, and some scholars even use Q, just the word Q, in a kind of colloquial way to just refer to that shared material between Matthew and Luke without insisting that it is a single source. Maybe it is multiple sources and not just one source, but we'll just call it Q. But anyway, she says on page 54, talking about Q, she says, "This is a conjectured document. Maybe it existed and maybe it didn't. If it did, we are to a large extent guessing what it contained." And that is just the most bizarre statement to me for someone. I mean, she's trying to demonstrate her understanding. Like, okay, people say I don't get this stuff, but I really do get this stuff. But Q is a hypothetical document, and we really, we're largely just guessing what it contained. Does she know what Q is? I don't it's really not clear to me that she really does understand what Q is, because Q is the shared material between Matthew and Luke, and we know what that material is. At its most basic level, it's the double tradition. It's where Matthew and Luke agree with each other. That's Q. And that's, again, maybe there is a larger document and we don't have all of it, and maybe it's multiple documents. There are different theories. Again, all of that aside, like at its most basic level, Q is the shared material between Matthew and Luke, and we know what that is. So then, on the next page, she says, after she kind of summarizes, okay, well, here's the bare bones of what the synoptic problem is, market priority, blah, blah, blah. She says, "I've stated these theories so far in their most minimal form." Did you? But it's important to realize that, unfortunately, sometimes a scholar's use of the two-source hypothesis, that's Mark and Q being the two sources, the two-source hypothesis comes with extra baggage that doesn't at all follow from a boring proposition like Mark wrote first and Matthew made some use of Mark. The additional baggage that often slips in without additional argument goes approximately like this. If Matthew's or Luke's wording in some story is similar to Mark's, then as far as the facts go, they were only using Mark for that story. They didn't have any additional information about what really happened. So if we see wording changed or some different material included in a story that is found in Mark, as well as in Matthew or Luke, we should assume that Matthew or Luke just made up the additional details without any good reason for believing they were true. This is another one of those cases where she doesn't cite any sources throughout this section, really, and she doesn't cite any sources in that paragraph I just read, but she makes this really, big claim about what scholars, she's stepping on the toes of redaction criticism and saying what redaction critics do and don't demonstrate. And honestly, she's talking as if redaction criticism as a field doesn't even exist, because the whole purpose of that field of research is to ask exactly these kinds of questions and to determine whether or not the gospel writers, when Matthew seems to be relying on Mark, but then diverges from Mark in key places, where are those divergences coming from? Is he relying on another source? Is he making it up? Does it fit with his own redactional profile? How would we know that? What do we see from the rest of his gospel? Is there language that he's using in those places where his language is differing from Mark? Is it in a way that fits with a pattern of material that is unique to Matthew elsewhere in his gospel, so that we might be able to say with some probability that this is a redactional tendency of Matthew to serve the purpose of his larger, individual theological interests? Those are exactly the kinds of questions that redaction critics ask, and she speaks as if that whole field doesn't exist, or if, to the extent that it does, they just are kind of playing fast and loose and just assuming things without argument. That's really irresponsible for her to talk that way. And it doesn't seem like she has really read any literature on that, or to the extent that she does, it seems like it is just in the context of apologetics, counter-apologetics debates online, like Bart Ehrman debates or stuff where it's just in the moment. And so like she's not looking at the scholarship behind those debates. She's just looking at the way that those arguments are being employed in those apologetics, counter-apologetics conversations, and making a judgment based on that and that alone. That's what it sounds like. And maybe I'm wrong on that, but again, she had an opportunity in this section where she's meaning to demonstrate her knowledge of the synoptic problem. She had an opportunity and she really missed that opportunity because it doesn't sound like she knows what she's talking about. But then just like 3 pages later on page 58, she says, she's talking about dependence and independence. And she says, dependence isn't a yes or no thing, nor am I suggesting the idea of partial dependence and partial independence out of the blue. It is supported by the facts themselves. Namely, in some stories, the story is the same between two gospels, and even some of the wording is the same, but there is also some variation of wording and some differences in what is reported, which just seems to be assuming her argument there that, if there is variation of wording, that equals independent access to the events themselves, which seems to be the exact kind of assumption that she's accusing critics of, that they don't actually make an argument for there being redaction here, or the gospel writers are just making things up. They just assume that to be the case. It seems like she is just blatantly assuming that where they do differ from each other, that's because they have independent access to these events, and so they are partially independent in those instances. And I don't see any real argument here, just the bald assertion that that is the case.
Well, speaking of bald assertion, on page 16, I have to take us back here. There's a quote. This is just like, so one of the things I noticed just is how she sort of used language. This is definitely a very preachy book. So like on page 16, like right before the chapter summary, she says, the evangelists, calmly unconcerned with the critical spirit of a later age, tell their stories accurately down to small details, because that's how things happened, because they have the facts at their disposal. We come along, and if we are wise, recognize and respect their casually correct information. So like that, to me, that's like the spirit of this book, where it's like you're saying like, okay, she's just sort of, a lot of this feels like she's giving reasons and stuff, but then like, so coming back to some of the language she's using with the synoptic problem, it's like just the language choice of some of this. I have to find some of it. It's like, let's see. She constantly is using using phrases like similar to, like language similar to Marx, like dependent somewhere, similar. Again, I circled that again. Like another time, similar word. It's like identical. It's identical. Like they're copying verbatim. Like, but the way she's framing it over and over, she's like, there's similar wording. There may be independence. It's like, what are you talking? Like, no, like that's I don't know. Like just some of Mark's wording. Like these are all. I'm saying these things. I'm not repeating myself. I'm looking at different pages that I've circled these things. Some of Mark's wording. I actually wrote. I wrote like eventually, like I kept circling it and just like wrote like a note at the top. Anyway, it's just in this chapter it was frustrating. Anyway, no. I don't want to go my own rant, but it was agitating. Anyway,
at the end, well, towards the end of that section, talking about the synoptic problem, this is something talking about her rhetoric. But she says, "I'm bringing all of this up to say this. If you hear anybody saying that undesigned coincidences don't make sense because they have to assume that the synoptic gospels are totally independent of each other, that's not correct. And if you're told vaguely that the synoptic problem disproves undesigned coincidences, that's not true either." This is something that just, a broader point about who the audience of this book is, and this is often a point that's made about apologetics in general, that apologetics is for insiders. It's not for outsiders. It's meant more for retention than outreach. It's for people who are doubting and trying to shore up their faith. And much of the rhetoric in this book, it comes across in this way, where it's her speaking to young people who might be shaken in their faith, and addressing the things that her critics say, and saying, well, if you hear my critics saying this kind of thing, then understand that that's not true. And it's just, okay, well, who's your audience here? And it's just, this clearly wasn't written for people like us. This was written for people who already believe, and it's again and again, she goes back to this kind of pastoral tone where she's counseling people on who to listen to and who not to listen to, on who to take seriously and who not to take seriously. And it's in this tone of like, if you hear people saying this about me, know that that's not true. And it's like, it's just a weird tone to take.
It sounds like somebody else I know, though. If you hear someone say, "There's the Christ" or "There's the Christ," do not believe them.
I was literally thinking, I was like, what is like? I was thinking of some biblical text, and I was like, I feel like this sounds similar, but that's fine. I didn't connect the dots in that way. But
she does say on that same page too, she says, if Luke or Matthew were merely trying to copy Mark and add an embellishment here or there, couldn't they have at least made sure not to contradict him? And again, that's assuming this kind of hindsight view of the canon, where like Matthew and Luke are looking at each other and they're like, hey, let's make sure to get our story straight with each other, and that we're not going to contradict, I don't contradict you, you don't contradict me, and let's not contradict Mark, because, that's scripture, and, that's divinely inspired, and we want to make, like, or like, if we're all hoaxers and we're trying, we're in on this together and conspiring, and it's just like, what, who thinks that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and see, she also says in that same page, and I have the slide up, she says, if there's one thing that apparent contradictions between accounts show, it's that literary theory is where one person is poring over the other person's story, making all his changes deliberately, are probably false. What? Like, how could you possibly justify that? And also, and this is, again, because this is how my mind works, we have examples in the synoptics where this is obviously the case, where they are pouring over each other's account. Like the example I give is the intercalated tale in Mark.
Wait, are you about to go to a specific pericope? And we can't. Sorry, that's the pericope by pericope approach, and you can't do that.
Oh, damn! Yeah. You know what? I completely forgot about. Well, I'm going to convert now. We can end this right here. But no, so seriously though, like look at how Mark tells the story of the healing of the woman with the issue of blood. Right, she's got this discharge, and it's intercalated. Right, so it means there's a story on one side and a story on the other, and there's a story in the middle. And when the story begins, Jesus is he's come off the boat, right? And he's crowded by a bunch of people. And this man named Jairus, he's the synagogue leader, comes up to him and says, my daughter is at the point of death. Please come save her. She'll live. And so the story goes, he's on his way. He gets interrupted, right? The woman with the issue of blood touches the hem of his garment and she's healed. And he's like, who touched me? And the disciples are like, wait, what do you mean who touched you? There's this huge crowd, He figures out who it was because she admits it, and they go on their way. But while they're going on their way, what happens? They're interrupted because some people from Jairus' house have come and said, your daughter's dead. Don't bother Jesus anymore. And of course, we all know how the story ends. Jesus gets there and he raises her from the dead. What does Matthew do with the story? So if McGrew is saying they're not pouring over their sources and just changing things deliberately, what does Matthew do with the story? Mm-hmm. When Matthew begins the story, he's changed the setting, number one. There's no crowd. The crowd's gone. And he does that. There's a reason for that. But but when the leader comes, he doesn't name the leader. He doesn't even call him a synagogue leader. It's just a leader. The girl's dead. The girl starts dead. And pursuant to that, consistent with that, is that Matthew removes the people coming from Jairus' house to report the girl has died. That is a deliberate change. Had that change not been there, had Matthew not omitted that, you might get away with saying Matthew's not making deliberate changes. But he keeps the story consistent. And he keeps it consistent by omitting that part of the scene. Moreover, in Mark's gospel, when the woman touches Jesus and he says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are like, "Are you crazy? Like, look at all these people." That's not in Matthew's scene either, because there's no crowd. Jesus doesn't need to ask who touched him because there's no crowd pressing on him in the same way it was in Mark's account. So her claim is just so demonstrably false. And this is one of the things that, it's what I've been saying is to take her apologetics seriously, to take her work seriously, you have got to really ignore the Gospels. You have got to completely ignore the story that they tell. But again, that undermines the very project that she set out to do, to establish the reliability. But again, like you said, it's the pericope by pericope approach, and so
even Mike
I'm dead in the water.
Even Mike Licona, I think, I forget the literary device that he calls it, but the example you just gave, and even he's like, yeah, like he doesn't call it a contradiction, but he basically identifies it and says, well, yeah, this is like a literary device, because obviously, like, it would be a contradiction if we didn't call it a literary device. So I forget what he actually calls it, but like, yeah, I mean, this is an example that he uses in his book. It's been a while since I've read it, and I forget the exact title of it, but anyway.
Yeah, but the problem with that is though, like Bart Ehrman. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, we should probably, like, in the chapter on undesigned coincidences, maybe just discuss pick one, like maybe the most, compelling undesigned coincidence, and just like talk about that a little bit so that we have a specific example to, really engage with her argument there. But I was going to suggest the why ask Philip one, because the feeding of the 5,000 and I mean, there are a couple points of, proposed undesigned coincidences in that story, but I think that if you guys are down for just looking at the feeding of the 5,000 and discussing that undesigned coincidences, that might be.
How are you guys? So
it's been about Ben, you've already written a lot on that.
Yeah, it's been about 2 hours. Are you guys good? Like, how's your battery, Matthew?
Got about 40%. I'm doing
okay.
All right.
So we're good. We're doing all right. All right. So Are you guys? Do you have any time constraints, Ben? I'm good. It's Friday night.
No, I'm good.
Okay. So yeah, because like the green grass, I'd love to talk about the green grass.
Oh, the green grass. Yeah.
That was another example. So, but I think you're right. I think we should actually, because that is, and again, we can still follow through the slides, but I think maybe picking out, again, we can't cover every single thing, and all, there's no way to cover a book like this in depth on a stream, but picking some really sort of examples that are latched onto, like the green grass or anything else that people like look at and they're saying, oh, this is a really good example of an undesigned coincidence, and saying, actually, that doesn't really work. I think that would be great to do. And
I do something, I mean, about just talking about the just kind of as a broad statement about the feeding of the 5,000 in general, is that, the question of like which hypothesis does it really fit? Does like undesigned coincidence, whether something is a true undesigned coincidence or not, the basic point about the feeding of the 5,000, that is the only miracle that we have that is recorded by all four gospels, automatically makes it such that there will be more fodder. So it's not surprising that there would be more material to whether there are true undesigned coincidences or whether they are manufactured undesigned coincidences, whether they are actually just genuine coincidences, or no, it's just if you have a story that you have, told by many different sources, and you have the more versions of that you have, the more material you're going to have to work with. And so either way, It's not surprising, because this is the miracle story that we have the most. We have 4 different accounts of, and so it's the one that apologists who argue from undesigned coincidences like to go through the most, because it is the one with the most material, and that's not surprising. But yeah, do we want to do the green grass first, and then maybe Philip next?
Was green grass one of the ones
I don't
she
know if she
mentions
actually
in
does.
this?
I don't know if she does the green grass in here.
Yeah, that's
She
in her
does.
other book, Hidden in Plain View.
So she does the why asks Philip.
It's such a good example, though, just of it's such an obvious example of it being wrong, that I feel like we should, one example of it going, awry, that we have to bring it up, what Ben has written on it. But yeah, go ahead. We can start with the Philip one, because it seems like that's what you were thinking.
So the basic argument for the Philip detail is that, and hopefully I'll get this right just off the top of my head, but it's that in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus, asks somebody. There's the whole crowd there who they're out in the wilderness. There's no food. The crowd doesn't have any food. They're hungry. They've been there all day. They're listening to Jesus speaking, and Jesus asks the disciples, or the disciples ask Jesus, where are we going to get food for these people? And it's a conversation that is had with an anonymous disciple, but they're near Bethsaida. Mark says that they are they're basically they're outside of Bethsaida, or no, Luke says they're outside of Bethsaida. They're in, which is interesting, and we'll want to talk about that detail. So Mark, they're just in the wilderness. They're in a desolate place. In Luke, they're just outside of Bethsaida. They're just near Bethsaida, by the Sea of Galilee, in the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee. In John, it doesn't say specifically that they're in that location that Luke identifies them in, but Jesus specifically, the disciple that Jesus has this conversation with about where to get food for this crowd, the disciple is Philip, and Jesus asks him, where are we going to get food for them? And earlier in John 1, at the calling of Philip, it mentions that Philip is from Bethsaida, and him and his brother, is it Nathaniel? Anyway,
I can't remember.
But they're from Bethsaida, and so Jesus, the undesigned coincidence is that in John, Jesus asks this disciple this question about where to get food, and it names the disciple, and it's Philip, who just happens to be from Bethsaida, but John doesn't specifically say that this happened in Bethsaida. Luke is the one who says that this happened in Bethsaida, but doesn't name the disciple, and so they casually interlock with each other, where they don't seem to be relying on each other or trying to fill in the gaps of each other. They're not conspiring to make this story work. It's just kind of off the cuff. One gospel writer gives this detail that asks a potential question that you might have from this other gospel writer, from this other account, and it has the ring of truth to it because of the fact that Philip was from Bethsaida. So Jesus is asking him specifically where to get bread, because he knew, this is your hometown, dude. Where's the best burger joint? Whatever. That's the undesigned coincidence. So we can go off of that.
So let me just say real quick, Raymond Brown, in his commentary on John, essentially, well, not essentially, I shouldn't say it that way. He floats the idea that yes, he doesn't use the language of undesigned coincidence, but he says basically, maybe this is a detail we get from another gospel, so maybe these kind of interlock in that way. So I think it is interesting to see other scholars, as we saw with Dale Allison, concede the possibility that these connect in this way. But that's not the only, that's not the only thing at play. So one of the first things that came to mind when I thought about it was, why Philip? Why not Peter and Andrew? Right? Because let me see. Oh, dang it. Let me see. Yeah, so here's John chapter 1, verse 44. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. So why focus on Philip if the reason that is being proposed here is that he's from Bethsaida? There's other options here. You've got two other disciples.
That kind of diminishes.
Peter.
If 3 out of 12 of them are from Bethsaida, then that does kind of water down the point. It's not just the one guy who's from there. He could have asked any of them.
Yeah, and I can't remember if Nathaniel is a disciple in John. Let me see. I don't remember because I don't think there's a list of disciples like there is in the Synoptics. Oh, but no. So at the end of the gospel, Nathaniel's listed. Of course, he's called Nathaniel of Cana from Galilee. But you would assume that Philip and Nathaniel would be from the same place if they're related, right? Well, are they related? You know what? I don't know that they're related. Let me take that back. I don't think they're necessarily related.
One thing that I do think is definitely worth mentioning is that John in general likes to give, like in the Synoptics, you kind of just have Peter, and like you don't the most of the disciples don't really have many speaking parts in the Synoptics. Like they're kind of just there, and you've got Peter and John, and then the rest of them are just kind of in the background. In John, he seems to, like, whether it's based in eyewitness testimony or not, or it's just giving verisimilitude for the sake of wanting to fill out the story. I mean, clearly John is more literary than the Synoptics, and so he wants to give you more details about other disciples, and that's something that the later non-canonical gospels, you see that trajectory where they're increasingly more interested in Thomas, in Nathaniel, in Philip, the Gospel of Philip. You have a curiosity about characters that early on don't really seem to have much of a role or much of a personality in the earliest accounts. So John, several points in the Gospel of John, mentions Philip. I mean, you talked about John 1. He also comes up in the upper room, the discourse in, what is it, John 14 or 15, where Jesus asks him specifically a question, and they have this conversation. So John is interested in Philip. John wants to give Philip more of a role. And so, and this is an instance where the Gospels have just, the Synoptic Gospels just have an anonymous disciple, or the disciples in general. And John is like, oh, okay, well, let's actually flesh that out. And whether John is inventing that, whether he is giving it, he's wanting to give more, verisimilitude to his account. And so let's give a specific, because that's good narration practice, or it is that way because it's based in eyewitness testimony. Either way, it's on the face of it, I don't see a good argument for favoring one over the other. They both make sense of the data as it exists. And the fact that Philip is a prominent character in John's gospel is another point that waters down the proposed undesigned coincidence there, because Philip appears several times throughout the gospel. John is more interested in Philip. So there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Another possibility in that particular passage, and this comes from Joanne Brandt's commentary on John, is she says that it's possible that because Andrew has a Greek name, right? That the people that come to him, or am I looking at the right passage? Let's see. Yeah. No, I'm looking at the wrong passage. Never mind. I'm trying to go through my Zotero notes, and I think I'm not doing a very good job of it. Let's see.
Maybe while you're looking for that, I'll just make a point here. On page 62, she says, this coincidence begins with the Gospel of John. According to the Synoptic Gospels, on the day of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus was with the crowd all day, healing and teaching. Perhaps later in the day, he and his disciples slipped away up the mountain for a little break. This is an interesting point that ties into what you've been saying, Ben, about how when, if you take McGrew seriously, you have to take the Gospels less seriously, because that detail that she says about going up the mountain, that specifically comes from John. The Synoptic Gospels don't have that detail in the feeding of the 5,000 about the mountain. Matthew does have that detail in the feeding of the 4,000. Mm-hmm. In the feeding of the 5,000, which this is a point where, okay, so Mark has two stories of the feeding of a multitude. It's got a feeding of the 5,000 and a feeding of the 4,000. The stories are almost identical, except the numbers are slightly different, and just a few of the details are slightly different. But looking at the redaction profile of Mark, it makes a lot of sense because Mark loves to tell stories in pairs. He loves to have these doublets, and it comes up specifically later on in the gospel when he says Jesus, in talking to the disciples and talking about the hardness of their heart, and they're blind and they're deaf and they don't believe, and he says, when I fed the multitude, when I fed the 4,000, did you blah blah blah, when I fed the 5,000, and he's making a point about how dull they are when he's been performing the same miracles again and again, how they don't understand what's going on. But so it specifically serves this purpose in Mark for this repetition that Jesus is doing these things over and over again, and yet the disciples are hard of heart, they are foolish and unbelieving, and they don't understand what's going on. What a lot of critical scholars would say is that it seems like Mark has two different sources for essentially the same story, and he just takes them both on board, tells them both because it serves his purpose of having this repetition, having these doublets, in order to make the point that Jesus is doing this over and over again, and yet the disciples are so dull, they don't get it. Matthew, in the feeding of the 4,000, has that on a mountain. The feeding of the 5,000 is not on a mountain. The feeding of the 4,000 is on a mountain. That's Matthew. Matthew loves to have things on mountains. He has a lot of different things on mountains. The Sermon on the Mount, famously, it's the Sermon on the Mount, but it's only the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. In Luke, it's the Sermon on the Plain. And then at the end of the gospel, Matthew, the only gospel that does this, he has Jesus appear on a mountain. It's the only appearance of the risen Jesus in Matthew, and it's on a mountain.
You're saying they have these unique personalities and characteristics. I don't
unique
it doesn't
redactional profile. Yeah.
It doesn't compute.
But John has the feeding of the 5,000 on a mountain. And it seems like, or you could make a good case that John, because John doesn't have a feeding of the 4,000, he doesn't have both stories, which Matthew just takes over both stories from Mark. John only has one story of the feeding of the multitude. And it seems like he takes the numbers from the first story, the feeding of the 5,000, but he takes the location from Matthew's version specifically of the feeding of the 4,000 and puts it on a mountain. Lydia is just harmonizing all of this, which, I mean, it seems like John is harmonizing it. But Lydia is just saying, what happened is that Jesus, later in the day, his disciples slipped away up the mountain for a little break. Well, that's not what all the Gospels say. That's what one Gospel says. And that seems to be a harmonistic tendency in the tradition if you are reading them horizontally, and comparing them, seeing the way that the story changes. You would notice that if you're reading them individually and trying to take them seriously for themselves instead of just trying to make them all fit. But yeah,
it's slick. It's real slick, because if you're not somebody who pays attention to the details, you're just going to be like, oh yeah, well that makes sense. But yeah, like you said, when you compare them, when you do an actual synopsis, that's when you realize, oh, these details are very different. So yeah.
And that's enough. I mean, it's worth saying too that, like, bring up the point about editorial fatigue here. That in Mark, Jesus feeds this multitude, in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, feeds the multitude in a desolate place, and that's why the question about finding food for them makes sense, because there's nowhere to get food anywhere close. And that is why then that is the kind of the big that is why the miracle is such a wow. There's no food to get anywhere around here. We're a long ways from any town. What are we going to do for all these people out here in the middle of nowhere? So Jesus performs the miracle. In Luke takes the story over from Mark, but he sets it in Bethsaida. This happens just outside of Bethsaida. But then he slips into talking about, when the disciples asked them the question, oh, we're here in this desolate place. Where are we going to get food? Well, you're right there at this town, Bethsaida. Like, there's food there. You can just walk right up there and get some food.
That's a mean thing to say about a town. It
doesn't make any sense. So what it seems, and this is Mark Goodacre's point about editorial fatigue, is that in this instance, it appears that Luke has just taken this story from Mark, and he relocates it to Bethsaida, but then he slips back into the language of his source, where it's a desolate place, even though that doesn't fit with his redaction in placing it in Bethsaida. And this is another point. So talking about this issue of the fact that this miracle story is the one that we have the most data for, because it appears in all 4 of the canonical Gospels. We would expect that there would be the most points of potential, undesigned coincidence, points of potential convergence, where the story is, oh, this could potentially answer a question that comes up in this one. But we would then also expect, oh, there is a wasp in my house. We would also expect that more data, more sources telling the same story would also give more opportunity for differences, for contradictions. And that's exactly what we see. They don't want to admit that. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have just the things that show potential agreements between the accounts, undesigned coincidences between the accounts, but they don't want to admit any of the places where there are contradictions or they don't line up. There's editorial fatigue. There is harmonization going on with John and the synoptics, and none of that can be admitted. Only this data that agrees with us. And that's the place where it's okay. Even if we like, let's just take on board all of the undesigned coincidences that they say for. Let's say, okay, yeah, Philip, like this in this instance, asking Philip this question, maybe this is rooted in eyewitness testimony. Maybe this goes back to early tradition. So what? You've got to also, like, if we're taught that they often, say, well, it's not just what's possible, it's what's probable. And this is a great point. It's not just what's possible, it's what's probable. So if you're going to, like, make a cumulative case for undesigned coincidences. Oh, there's so many undesigned coincidences. They pile up, they pile up, they pile it up. Okay, let's take all of them on board. But you also have to admit what is most probable in the case of all the contradictions, what is most probable in the case of things like editorial fatigue, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to do that. They want to bring on board their cumulative case for all the things that seem to speak to the reliability of the Gospels and leverage all of those things over and against all of the other data that points to them being less than fully reliable, and say our data cancels out all of that data, and we can't look critically at these details that seem to point in the direction of them being less than fully reliable. We can't go that pericope by pericope approach. We can't argue based on criteria of authenticity, et cetera, et cetera. We can't use the normal tools in the historian's toolbox when looking at these things, because we've established on the basis of these things that they're definitely reliable. So what do we do? They argue for that harmonization is a good historical practice. And
boy.
they're arguing that harmonization is a good historical practice based on this cumulative case of all of this overwhelming data that speaks to their reliability. This is, we have the right, or we have the impetus, we have the evidence on our side to give the benefit of the doubt to the Gospels in the instances where it seems like maybe if we were to look at this in isolation, this would suggest a contradiction. This would suggest that the Gospels are less than fully trustworthy. But we can't look at it in isolation. We have to look at it in context to this cumulative case for reliability. All you're doing is saying my data is better than your data.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things, all you really need to do to undermine this approach, and this is why I didn't really want to, I wanted to focus more on the actual details in this stream, because all you really need to do to undermine this approach is just point out mistakes. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the same thing. It's like they say that, they're not fundamentalists, but what do you have to do to undermine fundamentalism? I'll just show the Bible's not inerrant. Okay. By doing what? By pointing out several mistakes or contradictions or whatever. Okay. Well, even if they're not inerrantists, we can grant that. Well, if you point out even enough mistakes in the Gospels, or I remember before I had YouTube channel, and back when Eric Manning and I were blogging back and forth back in the day, there's something on Twitter I posted where I forget which guy, it might have been Luke, where I posted some screenshot of a commentary that suggested that Luke got some location wrong, and I forget the details. And he lost his mind and wrote a blog post in response, quoting 19th century sources, trying to.
Well, it's you can quote what is it, Colin Hemmer's work on Luke Acts, and it's showing all these places where Luke gets locations right, and he makes a lot of really good arguments and shows that there are a lot of places where Luke gets things right. So what? Well, that doesn't cancel out. That does not cancel out the places where he gets locations wrong.
Right, but that's what I'm saying is, but just one. So even if there's the sensitivity towards this approach is that even it's what they're saying is we have this abundance of evidence, and so it's okay, a mistake here or there, it doesn't really threaten anything. But practically speaking, that's not true. That's not how they actually act.
Yeah.
So if you actually just say, hey, actually, there's a contradiction here, and I want to say
no.
I want to say, well, it's not that there's not everyone. I think there's some people who say here's some examples of where I think there might be a mistake, but it just in general, most of the people that have this approach, that immediately upon hearing that there's any kind of contradiction, any kind of mistake, the immediate no, it's not, even no matter how plausible it is, so I just think in practice, no matter whatever they say about, this doesn't depend on inerrancy, it's even if you don't want to call it inerrancy, it's a pseudo version. It's you have to have because of the claims because they know, what I started out with the quote, if it has to be reliable enough that we can call people to repentance, and so if you start out with that kind of framework, then if you have stuff in the Gospels, even if it's not a ton of stuff, if you have enough stuff, like, okay, the author, Luke's getting, he's getting a couple things. He got some stuff right, but yeah, he's getting some stuff wrong here too, mixed in there. Can't have that, because that just undermines, it chops the branch you're sitting on if you're trying to make this, oh, we must convert the world to our religion. And so I think they know that. Mm-hmm. And that's why there's such a sort of, because to me, honestly, like the people that I've never, like, I don't want to say this is true of all of them, but some of the most defensive, like perpetually offended and defensive people I've ever seen on the internet are some of the people that defend maximal data. Yes. Like, yeah, I've never seen, like, I've never seen anything like it. It's amazing to me. Like, it is. I'm not just talking about one person. I'm talking about more than one person. I'm talking about more than one person. It seems like it's just like it's a I don't know. Anyway, it's just
the problem is they turn reliability into this binary, right? It's either reliable or unreliable. And that's not how anything works, right? If I ask my son how his day went at school, I'm going to get a whole lot of bullshit. Like, there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff that's wrong, but he's going to tell me a whole bunch of stuff that's also not wrong. It's not this thing where he's just unreliable because he, gets these details wrong, or he's reliable because he gets these details right. It's that you got to, that's not how that works. It's not how you determine reliability. But that's what they do. That's what the maximal data approach effectively, whether it intends to or not, effectively does, is it turns into a binary that is susceptible to being undermined very easily.
I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, but a friend of ours on Twitter, Joshua Parikh. I'm not sure if that's the right way to pronounce his last name. Great guy. He sent me this quote from Lentz. The book is Luke's Portrait of Paul, but he interacts with Colin Hemmer's work on showing the accuracy of the details in Luke Acts, and he says he makes this the overall Lentz's point in this book is to show Luke's agenda in the way that he shapes specifically the portrait of Paul for his purposes. But he says this is not to say that Acts is worthless in this respect, meaning historically. This is Colin Hemmer has recently shown that Luke offers precise geographical details and presents important material which can inform an historian about the world in which Luke lived. However, proving that Luke knew details does not excuse Luke from possibly manipulating his sources and shaping his finished product. That I think nails it on the head. That's all you really need to say. It's just, again, that's schizophrenic. Luke can't be like, both really accurate in some places and then also, manipulating his sources in others. And it's like, absolutely he can. But a really interesting exercise for me was going through Richard Purvow's commentary on Acts, seeing all the places where he quotes Colin Hemmer's work on the geographical accuracy of Acts. And Purvo obviously is a critical commentary. I mean, this is the Hermania series, and so it's this is prime critical scholarship. Does not think that Acts is an overwhelmingly historically trustworthy document, but he cites Hemmer's work favorably in a lot of instances, and it was really interesting. Again, it was like sometimes scholars admit like Dale Allison will take on board some undesigned coincidences, and that they're able to do that because they're open-minded. But there's this point in Acts. Okay, it's Acts. Gosh, I took a screenshot of this specific point in this commentary, and maybe one of you can help me with the exact location in Acts where this is. But it's this place where there's this journey, and Acts presents it as if this journey is a single day, from like when they arrive on the shore to Caesarea Philippi. Okay, no, it's from Ptolemais to Caesarea, or vice versa. But it says, Acts says, that it represents this journey as being a single day. And Purvo says, the journey would have taken more than a single day, as Caesarea is about 60 kilometers from Ptolemais, suggesting abbreviation, although it is barely possible to interpret the verse as leaving on the next day and in due course came to Caesarea. So he says that's barely possible, but it's again that question of what is possible versus what is probable. There's a difference, and if we're talking historically, we have to talk about what's most probable. It's highly unlikely that to read the verse in that way as making that kind of abbreviation. But he cites Hemmer. Says Hemmer says 30 miles, which is too short, and Hemmer finds that a suitable day's journey, which is a bit of an exaggeration. So, it's 60 kilometers. Hemmer wants to shorten that, say, it's just 30 miles. It's not just 30 miles. And to make it, just enough so that he can say, yeah, that's a suitable day's journey. That's really, 30 miles in one day at that time is really pushing it. But it's again, okay, because he points out all these places where Axe is remarkably accurate in its geographical details. It then biases him to say, well, it must be right in this instance too. It can't be wrong, and so it stretches things and in order to make it work. When if you're arguing historically based on what's most likely, just admit that this is unlikely, that this is, this goes against the case that you're making. And both can be true at the same time. Exactly like Lentz said, Luke can get some things right, Luke can get some things wrong. But did we want to talk about the green grass real quick before we move on from undesigned coincidences? I feel like it's okay if we camp out on undesigned coincidences because it's kind of one of the biggest pillars.
Yeah, I definitely think so. You've done some work on it, Ben. So I thought that was that was a good blog post that you had.
Not everyone thought that. Yeah, so that's another part of the feeding of the 5,000 from Mark's gospel is Mark notices the color of the grass, which is then taken to mean that it happened in springtime, but the evidence for that is kind of specious. It's not entirely clear that's the case because number one, you could have had green grass at other times other than Passover, right? And there's also kind of Mark exhibits this kind of interest in a shepherd motif. In fact, he even says in that passage, he looked at them as they were, as sheep without a shepherd. And so we already know how that Mark is fond of taking scriptural motifs and turning them into stories, or at least maybe not necessarily invention. Mark Goodacre calls it history scripturalized or something like that. Like you take a story, and you give it this kind of biblical motif, and Mark does that, so this may be an instance where he's taking, a psalm like Psalm 23 that he makes me lie down in green pastures, and putting that as part of the scene that
intentionally drawing out that symbolism.
Exactly. And I'm trying to
which McGrew finds just so unrealistic. Like that is the most ridiculous thing that anyone could suggest that. But the gospel writers do that sort of thing on more than one occasion. Well, it's not if your mind is steeped in this material, if this is the world that you come from, what's unrealistic about making those kinds of comparisons? Obviously just read Matthew's gospel, I think, is the most obvious, where it's he wants to, make these Moses comparisons. And so he's constantly drawing parallels between Jesus's life and the life of Moses and the Exodus. And, it's when your mind is steeped in these stories, in this tradition, you are going to find and make parallels between your story and that tradition. And so it's not unrealistic at all to see that taking place.
Out of Egypt, I have called my son.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah. Well, I mean, Jonathan Robinson wrote a book called Mark and Topology. And so he goes through that's 4 passages, and they're all miracles. But he talks about how the evangelist was using these stories to tell his own, and he's using very specific characters and scenes. Like when Jesus, the tempest comes up on the boat, right? And Jesus is asleep in the stern. And the language used there is very similar. It's evocative of the Septuagint's version of the book of Jonah. And so Jesus is kind of cast as this Jonah character. He's better than Jonah, right? Like, Jonah's in the boat asleep, despite the fact that he's running away from God's will. So Jesus becomes this better, almost anti-Jonah. He's a much better Jonah because he's in the boat and he controls everything. He's got supernatural ability to control the weather. But yeah, so the evangelists are doing this all the time, and so I think that's probably the best explanation for why Mark has green grass. The idea that because John has it as Passover, and this somehow fits in with it, is just it just seems far fetched. It just seems like you're ignoring how, and this again goes to something that I've been saying, how these authors tell their story.
Mm-hmm.
If you cannot ignore, it's not even the redactional profiles that are all that important in this case. It's just their narrative interests, their ability as storytellers, because they want to convince. Their interest is in persuasion. You don't persuade somebody by telling a really crappy story. Like, that's not, even if it's true, you want to make sure that it's palatable. And Mark does this. And so he casts his figures in this biblical motif. And then we see the signature in places like Mark chapter 6, where he has this detail about the green grass. They're like sheep without a shepherd. I think it's in that account also. He sets them down. He groups them. Well, this is the language there is drawing upon Moses, and Moses is, I think it's in Numbers where he there's a similar scene. But either way, I just
think you could also
grass,
like if just talking about Mark, why Mark says the grass is green. It's kind of a childlike redundancy. To say, and the green grass, where it's like, okay, well, grass is usually green if like you're sitting on the grass, but it could go down. I mean, if you don't buy into the Psalm 23 like reference there, it could also just go down to Mark, his verbosity. Because you mentioned this earlier, where in Matthew and Luke, and especially in Matthew, you find them, taking Mark and cutting out a lot of the unnecessary. Mark often has these doublets or like kind of just Hebraisms where he is just redundancies in his language, things where it's like, okay, well, you kind of said that already. You don't need to. It's just
early in the morning
wordy.
when the sun rose.
Early in the morning when the sun rose, that kind of thing. And green grass might just be one of those kinds of things where it's just like, well, you don't really have to like, specify, but it's him being picturesque. It's him, giving, it's like, why does he mention the pillow that Jesus laid his head on the boat? And it's just, it could just be Mark being Mark. And his way of kind of clumsily trying to add color and verisimilitude to his account in the limited way that he knows how. But the Passover detail in John fits right into John's his own narrative interests in placing almost all of his events around specific feasts. And Richard Bauckham, who is very interested in arguing for the reliability of John, nonetheless recognizes this fact in his book, The Testimony of the Beloved Disciple, points out that that John, in his mention of the Passover in his story of the feeding of the multitude, the Passover, well, I mean, what is the Passover? What do you do at the Passover? Well, you break bread. You have a feast to celebrate the Exodus and the deliverance from Egypt. And so specifically locating this miracle of the multiplication of loaves and fishes with this kind of Exodus symbolism of the Passover, putting it at that time makes sense in John. And he does that in many different places. Like he has the Feast of Tabernacles where Jesus stands up and says that, I'm whoever believes in me, streams of living water will flow from him. And like that fits right into the symbolism of the Feast of Tabernacles. And like that, even, I mean, when I was a conservative Christian, like when I believed in inerrancy, I read the Gospel of John and I recognized that is what John is doing. And at the time you could, have you could still believe in the trustworthiness of those accounts. You could believe that it really happened and that poetry is just the way that God was doing things. But nonetheless, I recognize that there is a symbolism there related to this, the feasts that this is taking place next to. But now looking at it, it's like, well, clearly, John is the only one who mentions Passover, and that fits in with John's interest in the feasts and his locating different events next to different feasts because of the symbolism of those feasts. And that explains that end of this undesigned coincidence.
I think one point just to bring up too is that it's sort of related to what you're saying, is that because of this, I keep bringing it back to the strength of the claims, that they're sort of making, is that it's not just what they need to argue in order to sort of make the claims they want to make. It's not just that, they can't just claim like, okay, the way that our account of things makes sense to believe. Like that's not all they're saying, and that's not all that they have to say in order to get what they're doing off the ground. They also have to say that alternative accounts don't make sense to believe. So like when we're giving alternative accounts of the same details, and we're like, well, maybe they're saying, what she wants to say is one thing, it's, different undesigned coincidences. And then we're just like, okay, well, it could just be, there's the synoptic problem. People are copying each other. The authors have their different emphases and personalities, and it could just be Mark being Mark or whatever, like these different accounts of explaining the same data. It's not just that they have to say that, their account could make sense or be rational for someone to believe. They also have to say that alternative accounts don't make sense. So, and I think the burden that they actually have with their position is higher than I think people realize, or that I don't know, that I wouldn't say that all of them wouldn't accept that. I just want to highlight that it's not just that they have to say, oh, you can be, look, let me show you how you can be a rational Christian. Here's how you could still. That's not what they're saying. They're not saying that. They're saying, look, like if this doesn't work, the Jenga tower falls. Like that's what they're saying. So yeah, they have to like when we're having these conversations and having these discussions, and people put forward other explanations of the data that of the same data that seem pretty plausible with the information we have. They can't just be like, okay, we can agree to disagree. We're going to have like, some rational Christians over here that just are rational in these ways. And we have different bodies of evidence and we assess it differently. And it's okay. They can't say that. So I'm just trying to highlight that the burden of this position is not to just, give some Christians a warm blanket to cover up it at night to make sure that they feel good. It's to actually say, if you're watching this somehow, or almost 3 hours into this, if you're a Christian that likes this and is still watching this, your burden is not just to like defend your own rationality with this. It's to actually say that people that disagree with you, like need like literally no one in good conscience that knows all the information that you do, or because I've actually seen like I remember I watched some of the discussion between Apologia and Jonathan McClatchy, which was disappointing in some ways because I don't think they agreed on like what the
conversation was even about. Yeah.
Right. So it was disappointing in some ways. But I think Paul asked him, like something like, could someone be fully informed and like disagree with you, like in good faith, basically? And I think McClatchy's answer was something like, no. like if you if you know all the stuff that I know and still have the same Bayesian understanding that I have, and you disagree with me, like there's like some kind of corruption going on or something like that. Like I could be misremembering that, but maybe it's not that strong, but it's basically something like that. Like there's something wrong with you if you have all of my knowledge of this and disagree. So it's the same. It's what I'm trying to say is like it bottoms out sort of that's why I keep saying it bottoms out sort of in a fundamentalism, in a kind of fundamentalism. Even if you want to say like there could be mistakes here and there, if you can really just look at if with all the complexities of what we're talking about, if you could say like if you just knew what I know and you just had the framework that I had and you knew all the same information and you came to a different conclusion, and your reason for explaining why the other person had a different conclusion is like there's something wrong with you, then in this case, I think you're just dead wrong. Like obviously, like there's some things like I don't think it's like wrong in principle to say that about some things. But like, this is not the kind of thing that you should say that about. This is like the epitome of the kind of thing that you shouldn't say that about. At least, okay. I have a tendency to rant. I would rather to listen to you guys talk than me. But
no, I mean, I think you're right, and a lot of this comes down, from my perspective, just to a consistent double standard that they will have when they're looking at the canonical documents. They find all of these remarkable instances that confirm historical accuracy. And I mean, I think in that conversation between Jonathan McClatchy and Apologia, Paul asked McClatchy at one point, is like, okay, well, it sounds like you're trying to argue historically, but you're presenting Luke and the other evangelists as being so historically reliable that do we have any other analogy to this level of historical reliability anywhere in the ancient world? I mean, let's talk about like the best Greek historians and the best Roman historians. Like, we can talk about all these instances where, they are like, seems like even the best historians in the ancient world got stuff wrong, and we're prone to exaggeration. We're prone to just uncritically take on board legends that we're just circulating, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems like you are arguing for a level of reliability in the case of the biblical histories that is unlike any other document in the ancient world. Is that true? And Jonathan McClatchy responded and said, I would not be surprised if the Gospels, the canonical Gospels, were among the, if not the most reliable historical documents in antiquity. And it's just, I mean, again, it's trying to argue historically, but like you said, it comes out to this conclusion that it's just like nobody arguing like on the basis of the canons of historical plausibility would actually make that claim unless they were being driven by some rather fundamentalist presuppositions. And yeah, so completely agree with that. But on that point of double standards, somebody asked me recently on Twitter, like, it would be an interesting exercise to like read the Gospel of Peter and to try and, see, are there any undesigned coincidences you can find in the Gospel of Peter? And I thought about it for a minute. I was like, okay, well, off the top of my head, there is this weird point in the Gospel of Peter, which is fragmentary. The Gospel of Peter is this very little chunk of text that we have that goes from the passion. It's basically just the passion narrative, and then the beginning of a resurrection narrative. You have the empty tomb, and then you have the beginning of an appearance that it then breaks off, and that's all we have. So there's not a lot to work with here. And again, as we were talking about with the feeding of the 5,000, the more you have to work with in overlapping material, the more likely you are to find at least prima facie undesigned coincidences, and the more likely you are to find contradictions. The less you have to work with, the less you have fodder data to work with either way. So anyway, that was an interesting challenge. Okay, Gospel of Peter, it's this very fragmentary text. We don't have a lot of it, but is there anything that could be seen as an undesigned coincidence in the Gospel of Peter? And there's this point in the Gospel of Peter where after the crucifixion, the disciples have all fled, and it's Peter talking in the narrative, and it says, we were hiding, we were in hiding, and besides all of this, we were fasting. And it just mentions that very seemingly casually that it's because it's not like a main point that he's making. It's just, and besides all that, we were also fasting. And that's all it says about that. But that's a point that none of the canonical Gospels say about the disciples' activity after Jesus's death. But there is this point in the Synoptics where Jesus makes this prophecy. He says, he describes himself as a bridegroom, and he's comparing himself to John the Baptist, and he's saying, we're feasting here. This is like we're at a wedding party, and I'm the bride, and while the bridegroom is with you, you feast, but soon the bridegroom will be taken away from you, and then you will fast. So on the day that the bridegroom is taken away, in those days they will fast. Speaking of his followers, his disciples. And that's an interesting little prophecy in the Gospels. And it's like, well, what is that referring to? Is that referring to the activity of the early church? It could be referring to the activity of the early church, post Jesus's death and resurrection, saying that, like, in the kind of interim between his ascension and second coming, or resurrection and second coming, that they will fast in those days. Or it could specifically be referring to the time of mourning just following his death. Him being, because he says that he'll be taken away from you, could be referring to that. Gospel of Peter speaks of them fasting after Jesus' death. These two things could interlock in this casual way where the Gospel of Peter isn't referring, but it doesn't say, and besides all this, we were fasting in fulfillment of, and we remembered the word that Jesus spoke, saying that when I'm taken away from you, then you will fast. It doesn't refer back to that and make it a prophecy and a fulfillment. And the synoptic accounts don't have in their passion narratives any reference to the disciples fasting. So they casually interlock. That could be construed as an undesigned coincidence. I think that's as good as most of, if not all of, the proposed undesigned coincidences that I've seen from McGrew or McClatchy or any of them. But Testify, Eric Manning, took to YouTube, and I gave that off the top of my head as just here's it's interesting. Could be, could not be. I don't have any skin in that game, but the point is that even if that would be an undesigned coincidence that reflects some early tradition that the disciples were fasting following Jesus' death, that doesn't say anything about the overall reliability of the Gospel of Peter, in general, like, obviously. But there could be some eyewitness memory contained in the Gospel of Peter. Like, that can be too. I think absolutely that can be the case. I think that there can be some places in the Gospel of Thomas that actually, have early tradition in them. I think there are places in the Gospel of Thomas that are like that. Anyway, Eric took to YouTube to respond to that and said, this is just a ridiculous, apples and oranges situation where he says, because of course the disciples were fasting. There's nothing remarkable or unexpected about the disciples fasting after Jesus's death. Of course they would be doing that. So there's nothing, there's nothing surprising about that. So it's not a convincing undesigned coincidence in any way, because it's just common sense that they would have been fasting. I was just like, what? How is it common sense that the disciples would have been fasting following Jesus' death, but it's not common sense that grass is green? I don't. But that to me, it often just comes down to this double standard, where you are wanting to argue for something in the case of your texts, your preferred,
It's not any. I mean, it's not any more common sense than the grass is green. So someone could say, like, because whether they would fast or not, or whether the grass would be green during a certain season or not, like either way, like you get like you can't just. It is a double standard. I'm just trying to like make it a little bit more modest what you're saying, where it's like it's just, if one of them can be common sense, then so could the other. Like that's the excuse that one is common, because anyway. But no, he's not in the business of doing response stuff anymore, Matthew. So
I shouldn't be responding to him. Sorry, Eric. No, and I like Eric. I think Eric is a really great guy, and I don't want to just like pick on him for the sake of picking on him. But it was something where he was incredulous that I could even offer that as a as a possible thing that is comparable in any way to any of the examples that they bring up. And I'm just like, clearly we're operating on very different levels here, but seems comparable to me.
I don't see. So that's the thing too, is like, if you think that if they, because of the Bayesian framework with which they assume, you'd think that because evidence is cashed out pretty loosely within that system, you'd think that they could just be like, okay, yeah, like you're right, that is an undecided coincidence, but it's very weak evidence that the overall reliability of that is good. But there's all these other reasons that go against it. Like you'd think that with their framework, they'd
be able to take that on board. Yeah,
just be like, oh yeah, you're right. Like it's the gremlins in my attic example, like I said at the beginning. Like, yeah, it's weak evidence, but all this other evidence means it's unreliable. But they don't do that. That's what I'm saying. In practice, that's not what they do, because it's not really about. There's more going on, like behind the scenes. Anyway.
Yep.
But I feel like we've gone away from your slides, Ben, and I do appreciate.
Sorry, Ben.
You keep putting. I do appreciate you keep coming back to this. In order to take McGrew's work seriously, you cannot take seriously the evangelist. I appreciate that you keep coming back while we go on these tangents. You just bring it back to this slide over and over. So
that's because the slide shows up a lot, and I'm just lazy. Just copy paste, copy paste.
I like it.
Yeah. No. I'm trying to think where to go next, because there's a lot more we could talk about.
I mean, how many more slides do you have? Do you have like a lot more slides?
Oh, there's a lot of slides, but a lot of it is like breaking down stuff.
Yeah.
And the way they uploaded it into this thing, it just screwed up everything. I hate it. But I don't know. I thought.
Well, if there's any, we've been going. We're like at 3 hours now, which I'm happy with.
Oh yeah, dang.
So we can keep going. Like I have no problem to keep going, but like maybe what we could do at this point is, if there's any specific examples, because if you have tons of slides, like I don't want to like pull like a digital gnosis stream and go for like 8 hours or something like that.
Yeah, no, that wouldn't be good. Well, no. So her section on her chapter on harmonization of the the chapters on harmonization, and the main example is, of course, the appearance narratives, it's incredible fodder for my point that she does not take the gospel seriously.
We should probably,
Matt,
I think that would be a great, no, I just think that let's camp out on maybe because I have 15% left on my battery here. But I think that it's really important that we do talk about that harmonization point, and where she actually lays out her proposed sequence of events, because I think it demonstrates a lot of what you've been saying throughout this. And I know, I would really like to talk about that before we finish, because I think it's important.
Yeah. So this is chapter 8. Is that right? Chapter 6, Unexpected Harmonies. And we've kind of already touched on the idea that, she finds harmonization to be a reasonable historical procedure. And I wouldn't say she's wrong, on that, but the issue is not so much whether it's a proper historical procedure, in as much as the the issue for me is um, she behaves the same way the evangelists do. She is a redactor. She is more than willing to change the sources to fit the narrative that she wants to offer us. And so there's a like so this is a Easter morning, Mary Magdalene and the other women come to the tomb and see the stone rolled away. Now, I tried to put some references in here to kind of base it in the text. Sometimes she's kind of loose with the language, so it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly, or at least to me. I'm not a very smart guy. But so either way, so this comes from Matthew. All the Gospels have this. The women go to the tomb. I put John 1 and 2. I put that 2 in bold because I think John assumes the women go, but he only has Mary Magdalene, but she says we. And so it kind of like, yeah, there's other people with her. Either way, it's across the board. The Gospels have this. Here we go. Mary Magdalene runs to tell Peter and John. This is from the Gospel of John. Meanwhile, the other women go into the tomb, hear the message of the angels, so on and so forth. Okay. So what she does is she takes the story of Mary and the women going to the tomb, and she divorces Mary Magdalene from it entirely. She describes it as being like a video camera. One camera watches Mary Magdalene, and the other camera watches the women that were with her. Mary leaves to tell the disciples. The only thing she's telling the disciples is that the stone was moved from the door, while the other women are there looking at the stone, and then they go into the tomb, etc. They see the angel, they hear the angelic message. But this is kind of why would you move Mary Magdalene out of the story? The only reason you would do it is if you had John's gospel. If you had Matthew and Mark, or Luke for that matter, this would not be something you would do. You would just be like, oh yeah, Mary Magdalene is there with them the whole time. But because she so emphasizes the Gospel of John, she has to make an exception to this. She has to change the game. And she even says that. She says, if we only had Matthew to go on, we would assume that this group included Mary Magdalene all through the passage. If one makes that assumption, and for the record, it's not an assumption. Okay, it's to that. If one makes that assumption, then one will assume that she met Jesus on the road in Matthew 28:9, but that assumption would create a problem. And then she explains why, because in John's gospel, you have this change, or this new narrative. Which I just think is it's such a candid admission that you're only creating this new narrative because you have a problem with one of your sources. But then what does she do? So this is Matthew's account, right? This is Matthew right here. You can read it. I won't read it. But when you read the text, like in verse 5, the angel said to the women, who is the natural, who would you assume, who would you conclude are the women in question? Well, a reader would go back to the first verse, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, right? You wouldn't think it would be anybody else. You would think in the Matthean narrative, these are the women that the angel speaks to. It is therefore also the women who are given the message to go. So when in verse 8 says they left the tomb, the they is, of course, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the other Mary. So she says it's not clear whether or not Matthew heard about the fact that Mary Magdalene left the group and met Jesus later alone, nor is it clear that he knew there were 4 or more women present. But he doesn't deny such a meeting between Mary and Jesus from John's gospel. He says that they met Jesus on the road. Once we realize by reading both Luke and Mark that there was more than 2 women present, Matthew's they makes sense even after Mary Magdalene is no longer there. So I gotta stop. This is like saying Matthew is right, but for the wrong reasons. Like he gets the they right, but he's wrong because Matthew clearly thinks it's Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. There's no doubt about that. You can't reason your way out of that unless you assume that Matthew is an unreliable narrator. And this goes back to a point I had made earlier. These are authors trying to persuade their audiences. If you suddenly Like, there's no reason a reader would say, "Oh, Mary Magdalene left. She must have left the group." No, to maintain consistency, Matthew, as a narrator, kept the women that he mentions as the women that were there. Where is it? Where is it? Oh yeah, okay. So here's Luke 24. So again, McGrew is trying to take Mary Magdalene out of it. This is the scene from Luke, but look at verse number 10. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women that told them who told the disciples this. Luke is straightforward. Mary Magdalene is part of the group. She is with the women all the way through, from beginning to end. But again, McGrew has to change the story because she has the Gospel of John. And for, I don't know why, but John has to have some kind of primacy among the evangelists. But yeah, so to take her work seriously, you just can't take the evangelists seriously. It's just you have no choice but to think they were unreliable narrators.
On that same point, that's the second point in her chronology, her proposed chronology of the order of events, but in the parentheses there, it says the angels remind the women that Jesus predicted his death and resurrection in Galilee, and also send word to Peter and Jesus' other followers that he will go before them into Galilee, and that a group of them will meet him there. So there she has just like taken the statements from Mark, I will go before you to Galilee and I will meet you there, and the statement from Luke, remember how he told you when you were in Galilee that he would rise from the dead, and she just says, yeah, the angel told them both things. Well, no, the angel tells them the one thing that he told you this when you were in Galilee in Luke, and it's in Mark that he says, I will meet you in Galilee. And she's like, yeah, he told them in Galilee that he would meet them in Galilee. He told them both things.
It's like, is it Matt Slick? I forget who I was reading, and they were trying to harmonize the angels in the accounts. And so his apologetic was, yeah, well, there was an angel, a young man inside the tomb. There was an angel outside the tomb. There was two more that came in the tomb. And then there was like, he has like 5 or 6 angels. It's just incredible. Like no, why do you do this to yourself?
But that's all. That also comes down to another place where it's like you really do come out with having this photorealistic view of the words, where it's the angel said exactly the thing that Luke records, and the angel also said exactly the thing that Mark records, and he said both of them, and they both just got half of the puzzle, and you have to put that puzzle together. But it is more or less verbatim, because it has to fit, and it's just
it's a weird way to proceed. I'm trying to figure out where I'm going with this.
That was it.
Yeah, so the other women meet Jesus on the road while they're running to tell the disciples. Again, when you read Matthew's account, and this cuts it off, but you can see verse 9, well, verse 8, they left the tomb. They left the tomb. Jesus met them, right? Who are the characters in the Matthean narrative that this happens to? It's not everyone but Mary Magdalene. In Matthew's narrative, there's a consistency, and it's something that the that McGrew and others don't appreciate about the evangelists is the level of consistency that they employ in telling the narratives, regardless of whether it's based on eyewitness testimony or regardless of whether it's true. They enjoy a consistent narrative style, and so to arbitrarily divorce a character from that scene, in my view, turns Matthew into an unreliable narrator, and it turns the gospel into an unreliable narrative. So Peter and John come back with Mary Magdalene, find the tomb empty, and leave. This, of course, is primarily from the Gospel of John, but you get it also from Luke, where Peter goes to the tomb, but he's not with John. He's just, well, and also I should say, she says Peter and John. That is not what the text says. It's Peter and the other disciple. I think that's how John,
the beloved disciple,
phrases it. She's a, he uses a couple different phrases to describe it, but either way, it's not explicitly John. That is an assumption she makes based on other data that is highly debated. But she, again, she there's a little bit of apologetic sleight of hand that if you're not paying close attention to, you miss. So Mary Magdalene remains crying. This again is John. She speaks briefly to the angels without realizing they are angels, and she sees Jesus and eventually recognizes him and runs to tell the disciples. The disciples are confused by all that's happened, and they talk about it all day, but they don't believe the women. That's more John. Private meeting with Peter. Of course, that's interestingly enough corroborated, or at least that's the wrong word. Paul mentions it, of course, that there was a meeting with Cephas.
What's interesting here is that she has to contradict several things here. She has to contradict Paul, because Paul has the appearance to Cephas first. In order to harmonize all of these, we have to have obviously Mary Magdalene first, and so Peter is not first. So sometime during the day, Jesus has a private meeting with Peter, and it's the one that is referred to just as an aside in Luke 24. But that also can't be the appearance to Peter that we find in the tag in John 21, because that in John's chronology, which is her primary, backbone to her chronology, that is the last appearance. But what critical scholars have long recognized is that appearance to Peter and some of the other disciples on the Sea of Galilee is very strange, because they show no awareness, or they're just living their lives fishing, and it's as if no other appearances happened previously. Peter has, this is the most, I think, significant point of all, is that Peter hasn't had any catharsis. He has this whole dialogue with Jesus where Jesus speaks to him and says, Simon Peter, do you love me? Yes, I love you. And, well, feed my sheep. And, it's this whole scene where Jesus reinstates Peter in his role. And after it's the antitype to the Peter's 3 times of denying Jesus. It's 3 times, I love you, I love you, I love you. And that is that is the resolution for Peter. And so, and that happens in the context of John with these other disciples present. So what you have to posit here is that there's a separate first appearance to Peter that Jesus doesn't provide any. Peter doesn't get any of that catharsis. He doesn't get that resolution, and Jesus appears to him, and then he still just is like, okay, yeah, I'm going to go back to my old life of fishing, as if none of that happened. But obviously, in the Gospel of Peter, you have what seems to be that appearance on the Sea of Galilee as the first appearance, and that's where the Gospel of Peter gets where it cuts off. Is it seems like it's going in to tell that story about that appearance of Peter, and that is first in order, and that would make sense just from that pericope on its own. It seems to have the quality of the first appearance, which would fit with Paul's chronology in 1 Corinthians 15 of that being the first appearance. But again, you don't get any of that when you're trying to harmonize. You have to have a separate appearance to Peter that doesn't have any of that catharsis, that we don't have any details of, that is not the first appearance. And so, again, like you're saying, it makes everything not work by trying to make everything work.
Yeah. Okay, so number 8, the evening two disciples, this is the road to Emmaus scene, right? So this is from the Gospel of Luke. So this number 9, shortly after the Emmaus disciples arrive, Jesus appears to 10 of the 11 core disciples and the others who are with them. And Jesus shows his hands and feet inside, eats some fish and honeycomb, talks with them for an unspecified period of time. Quick note, that piece about the honeycomb, that it comes from Luke, but it comes from a textual variant that a lot of scholars just don't think is belongs. But
does that mean she's reading the King James here?
Which I don't know. The translation of choice in what she says is what she quotes, and in the copyright page too, it says it's the NASB. But I looked at the NASB and I'm pretty sure I didn't see it there. So I don't know. Maybe she's remembering it from when she was younger, or I don't know. Oh, damn it. These stupid slides did not. Okay, well.
You cannot cuss on this channel.
I just did. Okay.
Just joke.
Okay, the appearance. So Thomas is not there at this meeting, right? That's what she says.
There is a footnote. I don't know if we want to mention this, but on point 9, the that shows his hands and feet, side, eats some fish and honeycomb, talks with them for an unspecified period of time. Footnote: there's a big difference between just being non-specific about how much time something takes and deliberately trying to make it look like something took less time than it really did. The former is a type of what I have called a chronological narration, referring back to that. Narration without specifying time. This seems to be what is going on in Luke 24. It's very important not to confuse this with the authors deliberately changing the facts about time. Again, it's just she has to have it that way. They can't be deliberately changing things. But.
Yeah. Well, and I may be jumping ahead here, but what's interesting is that, so in number 9, she says that Jesus appears to 10 of the 11 core disciples. That is not what Luke says.
No.
Like, Luke is very clear. He says that they go back to Jerusalem, they find the 11, and they talk about everything, and then the next paragraph says, while they were still talking, right, Jesus appears to them. Who's he appear to? He appears to the 11. But it can't be the 11 from McGrew, because she has a story in John where Thomas is not there at that meeting on Easter Sunday.
Yep.
But it's, again, just more evidence that in order to take her seriously, you cannot take the evangelist seriously. Like, it just completely undermines the reliability of the Gospels by her constant changing of her sources. But again, I'm okay with it because it's what the Gospel writers themselves do. They're more than willing to change their sources, so that's cool. Just I'm trying to rush through these because I know we don't, between battery life and what time it is. So if there's something that you guys pick up
No
on,
time to meet. That was great. Peter. Okay,
yeah, there's no time to meet Thomas. Like, yeah. Okay, there's the point about the 11 that I was making.
Okay, meanwhile, so a week later, in Jerusalem, Jesus appears to the 11, including Thomas, and convinces him. That parenthetical gets me on point 10. Meanwhile, word is going out to a larger group of Jesus' followers that there is to be a meeting in Galilee. like, hey guys, there's going to be this big evangelical conference, and Jesus is going to be there. And it's like, where do you get that? Like,
yeah, exactly. I forgot about that parenthetical. Let's see. I'm trying to highlight, because some of this I talk about in the review, because I give 3 places where she quite obviously changes the narrative to suit her purposes. The 11 is one. The Mary Magdalene thing is one.
Well, I actually
that
think it works out.
That point. Oh, that point about
Go ahead.
The word going out to everyone that there's going to be a meeting in Galilee is just so funny, because in Mark and in Matthew, all you have is a meeting in Galilee. It's in Luke and in John that you have this stuff happening first for Luke, it's only in and around Jerusalem, very clearly.
Yeah.
For John, he seems to be harmonizing all these traditions, and so he has everything happening first in Jerusalem, per Luke, or the traditions that Luke is drawing from, and then he also has traditions from Galilee, that, like the appearance to Peter, and so he includes those at the end too, even though it doesn't really work, because that appearance to Peter in Galilee really clearly seems to be the first appearance, the first time Jesus has appeared. The integrity and message of that vision really seems to be making that point. But so she has, it's only on point 10 now, after all of this stuff has gone on in Jerusalem, all this sequence of events. Now, okay, word is going out, there's going to be this meeting in Galilee. And then point 11, Peter and the rest of the 11 travel to Galilee following Jesus' instructions, which is just, again, like, so you're for Mark, it's before Jesus has even gone to the cross that he says, okay, this stuff is going to happen. I'm going to be betrayed into the hands of men. I'm going to be, be crucified. I'm going to die. I'm going to rise again, and I will meet you. I will go ahead of you and meet you in Galilee. So he has given them this word about meeting them in Galilee before any of that happens. Before he's even been crucified, and then the angel tells them at the tomb, remember, he's going to meet you in Galilee, and so in Matthew he does meet them in Galilee, just like Mark's narrative promised. And that's all you have in Matthew. But then to have it doesn't make any sense for this. Like, you have all this stuff. Why would he even have told them before he even went to the cross that he would meet them in Galilee, when he was going to meet them 8 times in Jerusalem before they go? They're like, after all this, oh yeah, he said he was going to meet us in Galilee, so like, let's go back to Galilee, guy, because he's going to meet us. And he's like, well, I've already been meeting you here 10 times. Like, what's the significance of that? Like, guys, there's going to be a meeting in Galilee. Let's go to Galilee. Like, it doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. Yeah.
So point 12, Peter and the 6 others go fishing on the Sea of Galilee. So they're like, they've gone to Galilee. They're waiting for Jesus now, even though they've already seen him a bunch in Jerusalem, and meet Jesus unexpectedly on the shore the next morning. Is that editorial fatigue on McGrew's part there? Like, because John carries that same editorial fatigue where it seems like it's an unexpected encounter. It's not unexpected on McGrew's terms.
No.
On McGrew's terms, it's very expected. The word is going out. We're going to meet Jesus in Galilee. He said it. So the 11 travel to Galilee following Jesus' instructions. He's going to meet us in Galilee. He appears to them unexpectedly. It appears to them. Who is that guy out on the shore? We don't even recognize him. Oh, that's Jesus? We had no idea. Like, how surprising. Oh, finally, catharsis. Like, an example of editorial fatigue for McGrew.
Yeah.
She didn't take her harmonization all the way.
No, she laps back into her source. Okay, so some of this stuff is just pretty. It all flows, and I hate the way this lined up. It flows from her assumptions about the narratives.
And I have to say this one more time, but I mean, counting them at this point where Peter and the others go fishing on Galilee and Jesus appears to them in McGrew's. In her chronology, this is actually the 4th time that Jesus has appeared to Peter. Like, the first time to him alone, and then 2 other times he has appeared to him already in the context of the other disciples. And so it's the 4th time that Jesus appears to him that he finally takes care of business with Peter and reinstates him, and deals with this unresolved issue of his denial. Like, how unrealistic is that?
I feel like this is a 10 out of 10 rant, Matthew. I think you need to keep going.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I can't get over that one.
No,
you feel pretty passionately about this.
This has been good so far. There's only a couple more points.
Yes. Okay. There's what are we on number
13?
14? What are we on? 13. So the 11 and a larger group meet with Jesus in Galilee, almost certainly outdoors in the hills, at a place he has designated for the meeting. Which she's getting this from Matthew, right?
Yep.
Matthew 28. Yep. But where is she getting this larger group? Matthew is clear that it's the 11, right? I think this is one of those places where she's like, well, it doesn't say there wasn't. Like, it's like her apologetic for the two beasts of burden that Jesus rides in Matthew, and Mark only has one. Well, it doesn't say there wasn't another animal. Like, I think she assumes that because there's people who are doubting in Matthew, and the disciples have already seen Jesus per her chronology, like with Luke, that there must be another group. But again, it's because she's not taking the narrative seriously as the narratives. I have no problem thinking that some of the disciples, didn't believe. It's the first time they saw Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew after his death. Like, it makes perfect sense in the narrative why this happens. It is, and again, it is only when you try to harmonize this that you have to come up with these just, ad hoc, attempts to reconcile the data.
Yeah.
But
so it's because Matthew mentions the doubt, but in her chronology, this is the 5th appearance to them, that she has to have it be a larger group
doubt
in order for there to be other people who this is the first appearance to, so that they could doubt that. Is that why? Yeah, I think she says as much, that's essentially why this is the preferred chronology, to make it make sense. But again, why does it have to make sense? Why can't Matthew just be Matthew? Why can't Luke just be Luke? Why can't John but just be? Why do we have to smash these accounts together? Well, either way, okay. Over the next several weeks, Jesus meets with the disciples on some unspecified number of other occasions. Eventually, they return to the Jerusalem area. He meets them and he tells them to stay in Jerusalem until they receive the Holy Spirit. So that over the next several weeks, that's obviously she has to fit it into Luke's Acts. Specifically Acts' mention of 40 days. It's over a period of 40 days that he appeared to them. And that's something that, like, what you talk about, like literary devices of like telescoping. It's okay. So Luke mentions, it has everything happen in one day. The ascension happens on the same day, it seems, that all of the appearances took place in. But then in Acts, you have, it actually took place over 40 days. And well, okay, so this is the same author. So this has to be a literary device where really it took place over 40 days. And Luke's one day fits into Acts' 40 days, but obviously it wouldn't be vice versa. So it literally, you have this literary device of telescoping specifically because it works by having one day fit in 40 days. It doesn't work to have 40 days fit into one day. Yeah. So it has to be that the only source we have that mentions 40 days, Acts 1, takes primacy over all of the other sources that on face value don't agree with that. Like multiple attestation be damned, embarrassment be damned, any of the normal criteria of plausibility, throw them out the window, because this is the only way it works.
Yeah. Yep.
But it doesn't even work because for Luke and Acts, they're in Jerusalem the entire time. Jesus specifically tells them, don't leave until you're endued with power from on high. And they don't go anywhere. They stay in and around Jerusalem until those 40 days are over. But for her and her chronology, she has to have them go outside of Jerusalem to fit in all the other appearances from the other Gospels. So over the next several weeks, taking Luke's chronology of 40 days, Jesus appears to them in an unspecified number of locations and occasions. Eventually, they return to the Jerusalem area, which this just flies right in the face of Acts, even though she is depending on Acts for this chronology.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when he tells them to stay. It's only after they have then returned from Galilee that he tells them not to leave, which is not what Luke says.
No, it's what she does is she takes Jesus's appearance and she divides it into two separate scenes. And so wedged in between, specifically verse 43 of Luke chapter 24 and verse 44 of Luke 24, is everything else, right? Yep. So there's like this gap in time. Even though the way the narrative flows, that's not a normal way to read that. Like, that's not how Luke is writing this narrative.
Just a heads up that I'm gonna have to leave in like 2 minutes.
Oh boy. Okay.
All right. I mean, we could.
No bueno.
Yeah. I mean, we could basically wrap it up because, I mean, like we've said at the beginning, this is just, we went on a roughly 3 hour and 30 minutes, just stream of consciousness, just talking through this. But, Ben is going to be like a good follow-up to this. If you've made it this far, is that there will be a book review that's more formal and like technical than what we've been able to talk about here, because
there'll be lots of citations, and I'll go into detail a lot more on certain aspects of the argument that I find problematic. So
I mean, it actually works out really well that we're both doing a stream and you're doing a book review that's more formal. I mean, I think it works out perfectly. So
yep.
Any last?
I do have just I do have to just read her conclusion at the end of that chronology that she gives. Is this picture here is coherent and plausible. Skeptics, of course, deny the resurrection have happened at all because it is a miracle. But they will also, the only people who object to everything that I've said here are people who deny this because it's a miracle. But if you're unbiased and you're looking at the facts, this is coherent and plausible. Like everything that we just went through. Yikes.
Hey, if she's if she's okay with changing the Gospels and to suit her purposes, more power to her. Just do what you want with them.
Amen and amen.
All right. Well, that seems like a good place to end. So I appreciate both of you coming on. I'm sure that this will be a fun stream for people to watch of all different persuasions. So
looking forward to the response from Testify.
Oh yeah. Okay. He doesn't do those anymore. I'm just kidding.
No, he doesn't.
All right. I'll talk to you guys later.
Have a good one.
All right.